Big Dumb Movie is a comedic podcast that often contains obscene language and outlandish commentary. Listener discretion is advised.
Hello and welcome to Big Dumb Movie, where we discuss movies of the 2023 variety. I'm your host, Korey, and Big Dumb Movie is back from a much-needed break. And I just want to say that I appreciate you listeners and your patience during our extended and unannounced time off. I know I don't actually release a lot of episodes here for this podcast, but I am always working on podcast-related stuff, and I took some much-needed time off. And I'm here alone today because I wanted to do an episode that's a little bit different this time for our return. I'm here to do a ranked list of all the movies I saw in theaters last year, 2023. This is something very different for this channel, not our usual content, but I thought it would be fun to work outside my normal comfort zone for our return episode. I'm doing this episode alone, but you might get a couple special guest appearances along the way. I'll be discussing each movie as I go through the list, and there will be no spoilers for this. But at the very end, I will elaborate on some specifics in a designated spoiler section for some of the movies. Again, at the very end. I'll give a warning when the time comes, and there's probably timestamps in the description depending on how lazy future me is. So just know that if I do go into plot points for these, it's probably stuff that's already in the trailer. I also want to say that this episode is very much inspired by my friend Film Dylan from the Cinestudy podcast. Regular Big Dumb Movie listeners will probably remember Dylan from our episodes on Scream, Indiana Jones' Crystal Skull, A Nightmare on Elm Street vs. Friday the 13th, which is one of my personal favorite episodes of Big Dumb Movie. At Cinestudy, Film Dylan does episodes like this, which I'm always very impressed by. He ranks movies for a given year, and he always has such insightful things to say about them. Check those out. He's far more intelligent than I am when it comes to film discussion. And you can also hear me on his podcast, where we did an episode of our top 10 movies of the 90s, and then later we did our top 10 movies of the 80s. Those are episodes 41 and 47 of Cinestudy. Those were a lot of fun. If you haven't listened, then check those out. Some of the spoilers guys are present as well. It's a good time. So for this episode, I have some arbitrary rules that I kind of set for myself. In this list, I'm only going to include movies that I actually went to the theater for. And of course, I didn't get to see everything I wanted to. I just didn't have the time. For example, I wanted to see David Fincher's The Killer, but it was in theaters for like one weekend, which I wasn't aware of at the time, so I missed it. That was one where I kept thinking, I'll catch that one later, but it just didn't happen. I did see a few movies outside of the theater as well, like Blackberry, but I'm not including those here. That is a great movie though, Blackberry. To me, there's something about seeing a movie in theaters that kind of makes the experience like official. And I'm not trying to go all AMC Nicole Kidman or anything, but my attention level is just different in a theater environment. That might just be a me thing. So I ended up going to the theater 30 times last year, so I'll be talking about 30 films. Some of which may have come out at the end of 2022, but I saw in January of 2023. That might be a slight rule breaker for what people normally do with these kind of lists, but that's what I'm doing. 30 movies. 30 is personally a bit disappointing. I was really hoping to get to more. A few years back in 2017, seems like yesterday, I went to the movie theater over 100 times. That was a big year of movies for me, but of course it was before I had a podcast, so there was a bit more freedom in my life. With this ranked list, I also want to say that I do personally struggle with ranking movies because it just feels so final, and how I feel about movies can change. So that's another disclaimer for you. This is the current order of my personal favorites, and my personal favorites are subject to change. Probably not by much though. But next year, this list might be slightly different. This is what they are now. And of course, speaking of personal favorites, I'm in no way saying this list is objectively the best and worst movies. That probably goes without saying, but this is my list, right? The ones I liked the most and the ones I liked the least. And last thing, I'm not going to do a full play-by-play here. I just can't talk about each movie for an hour and then break them down the way that we normally do on this podcast. So what you'll get here is the rankings and some quick thoughts. Call it a brief review if you want. All right, let's go. Number 30, Transformers: Rise of the Beasts. I should preface this by saying that when I was a kid, I liked the Transformers animated series called Beast Wars. I liked it, but I loved the toys. The toys from this line are among my favorite of all time, and I am a toy collector of sorts. Scorponok, love that one. So I did go into this with some level of predisposition to liking some elements of this franchise, but also, and longtime listeners will know this, there is not a single live-action Transformers movie that I have liked, and I go to see them all. Sometimes Steve calls me a glutton for punishment. I know there's apologists for the 2007 movie, the first live-action one, and some people think Bumblebee was good, and that one was better than its predecessors, but I hate all of them, and I hate this movie. Transformers: Rise of the Beasts feels like a movie written by an AI. It's a soulless husk of a movie that's just generic and really uninspired. Like almost all Transformers movies, we have very basic bitch humans. They meet the Transformers and they have to help them get a thing to stop a thing. They chase the thing around, the bad guys want the thing. There's robot on robot action, of course, which is slightly less chaotic on screen than some of the other movies, but still really messy. And I don't think it's just the excessive special effects that make these action scenes messy, generally speaking. There's just too much shit happening on the screen. The ending set pieces to these movies are just pandemonium. This Transformers movie has the Maximals, which are like the animal Transformers. I think the gorilla guys on the poster. Unfortunately, they're just about as boring as the Dinobots were in whatever the other movie was. Just about everything and everyone in this movie is one note. I don't actually have much to say outside of that. There's a lot of these movies, and they're all very similar in plot structure and in their flaws, with few exceptions. This movie is just nothing. It's just a CGI circle jerk of nothing. The characters are vapid, and the moments are predictable. The most interesting thing about this movie is also kind of the cringiest thing, which is a tease for something that I won't spoil here, but good God, I'll just say this, they're really reaching to drum up millennial interest in the next movie. And I have seen some people online say they really like this movie, but I just don't see how anyone over the age of 9 can really get into this. If you can, more power to you. I'm sure there's things that I like that people would say the same things about. Also, this has nothing to do with anything, but I've maintained for years that if I could travel back to like 1920 and show those fucking alcoholics any movie, it would be a Michael Bay Transformers sequel. Maybe not this one exactly, but imagine showing them Transformers 2 or Transformers 3. I think it would literally put a person from that time into a coma. Anyway, I hate this movie. I hate all the live-action Transformers movies. I'm sorry if you wanted more from me on this one, but if you've seen one Transformers movie, you've kind of seen them all. To quote young Elizabeth from Drop Dead Fred,
"What a pile of shit."
Number 29, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. Yeah, so here's another one. Believe it or not, I generally try to only see movies I think I would like. I saw this movie anyway, though. The main reason this one is above Transformers in my ranking is because there were moments, flashes really, where the action scenes worked. You'd get about a 2-second moment of the fight scenes every now and then where things did look genuinely impressive. Namely in the fight scene where Aquaman and Orm face off against Manta for the first time. And for those deranged souls that have seen the movie, it's the one where there's like a mech suit involved. But of course, this movie does not work for me. Didn't work for most people, as it turns out. Manta is back as the villain, played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen. He's an actor I like, and he interestingly referred to this role as clown work. I didn't read the full article on that because the ads would probably crash my computer, but that is a golden quote. Aquaman 2, clown work. But Manta, he's a classic Aquaman villain, but this time he has the evil black trident. Oh no! Remember the last Aquaman movie? Well, me neither, but in that movie, Aquaman needed to get the better trident to beat the villain. Well, what if this time the villain had the even better trident? That's fucking cinema, baby. I mean, none of this really matters. You're not going to remember the plot of this movie 2 months after seeing it. It's just not that kind of movie. The whole thing feels mostly boring and meaningless. A lot of it is unfunny banter between Aquaman and Orm, who's Patrick Wilson. He was also a villain in the last movie, but now turned ally. Momoa tends to be this guy in a movie that like has a laugh and slaps you on the shoulder a lot. That's what we get a lot of here. Like he says something to Orm, and Orm is the serious guy, and he doesn't find any of this nonsense funny. If anything's gonna grab your attention in this slog of a movie, it's actually probably how fucking jacked Patrick Wilson is as Orm. Also, Amber Heard is in this movie. I know some people just hate her automatically. She's completely fine in this movie. In my estimation, she did nothing to drag this movie down. That would be more like the messy script, which again sees Manta go on a quest for revenge against Aquaman with these super like undead D&D necromancy powers that he now has because he has the better trident. Aquaman, he has a family now, and in order to stop Manta, he has to team up with his old enemy Orm, and then CGI ensues. This is all in the trailer, by the way. None of this is spoilers. Aquaman and Mera, Amber Heard, they now have a baby, which is essential to the plot of this story and is also in the trailer, but I did hear something interesting about this one. I don't remember where exactly, probably a podcast, but supposedly during the test screenings of this movie, the baby was killed by the villain. So I guess that was in the original cut, or at least it was rumored to be. That seems fucking crazy to me, but considering the crazy shit that went on with this movie, I am willing to lend that rumor a little bit of credibility. There were tons of reshoots here, that's definitely real, and you can kind of see it in the movie with Aquaman's home life, where Mera is not around when you think she would be. Apparently Amber Heard also had some drama with Momoa, something to the effect of her thinking she was being mocked about her Johnny Depp situation by Momoa intentionally dressing like Johnny Depp, but Jason Momoa just dresses like that. And then Dolph Lundgren, who was also back for this, had an interview where he said that he thought the, quote, original version was good, and he basically indirectly acknowledged that this reshaped version of the movie isn't good. And if he was implying that, I do agree. So a movie riddled with drama has problems, not surprising. A lot of this movie's underwater. It's actually the second movie I saw in 2023 where the lead character is underwater a lot of the time. And I think that's a really bad move right now, considering Avatar 2 came out the previous year, and honestly, kind of revolutionized the look of characters underwater in a movie. It just makes this one look particularly cheap. Like that movie or not, James Cameron put some real time and effort into making it look as ideal as possible. Characters underwater, I mean. That certainly was not done with Aquaman 2, right? This is kind of like if The Bourne Identity came out after John Wick or something. Well, I'm not saying The Bourne Identity sucks the way Aquaman 2 sucks, but the action scenes in that movie compared to the likes of John Wick are like night and day, in my opinion. Maybe like GoldenEye and Casino Royale is a more digestible example. Anyway, the failure of Aquaman 2 is on the movie, certainly, but it's also partially related to the way Warner Brothers is restructuring DC. I think the audience's perception might be that the stakes are just not as high, knowing that this movie doesn't lead to something that leads to something that leads to Darkseid. And that is unfortunate. I don't like the precedent that's been set by other superhero movies in that way, but this movie isn't doing itself any favors. If this movie were great, that situation would be significantly more tragic. The first Aquaman movie made $1 billion. This one did not quite reach those heights financially. As it stands, what Aquaman 2 needed was a really good self-contained story to kind of send off this character as the DCEU, if that's even what they're calling it, is restructured and rebuilt under the new man in charge, James Gunn. But what we got, unfortunately, is just a sequel by committee. Number 28, Wonka. Ugh. Jesus, I did not like this movie. But unlike the last two movies, this one was not offensively bad. In fact, my biggest problem with this movie is how inoffensive it is. I've been a longtime fan of the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. After seeing the new Wonka movie, I think I understand better the thing that has always drawn me to the original, which is the underlying cynicism. I like the dark elements of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And not just the boat ride scene, which is cool, but just the underlying sinister nature of it all. And Wonka's I don't give a fuck attitude about the death or deformity of a little fucking bad kid. In the original, Willy Wonka is like a snarky, vengeful fuck with a twinkle in his eye. Timothée Chalamet, he's an actor I like a lot. What he's told to do in this movie, though, is play Wonka as like the most earnest, good-hearted, good-natured, young Anakin Skywalker human imaginable. He has the twinkle, but he's like all twinkle. He's more like Charlie Bucket than Willy Wonka. And maybe that's the point. Maybe he starts like Charlie and becomes jaded over time. But if that's the case, this movie gives no indication of that progression. And the hypothetical movie where that does start to happen is the movie we should have gotten. The cynical character is the Oompa Loompa, played by Hugh Grant for some reason, who apparently hated doing this movie due to the CGI equipment he had to wear. He referred to it as a crown of thorns. I assume he meant his headpiece for the CGI scenes. But it's just hard to believe that this guy Chalamet becomes Gene Wilder. He's definitely not the Johnny Depp Wonka, because that's like daddy issue Wonka, and Chalamet is mommy issue Wonka, but only to the extent that he's kind of doing this whole chocolate thing out of a warm, nostalgic place as it relates to his mother. So the comparisons aside, this movie by itself is just way too safe. Like, I feel like a movie with an evil cartel and shades of human trafficking should have some level of dark tones or some indecency, but it feels like the most Disney-fied fucking thing you've ever seen, and it's not even a Disney movie. Wonka wants to open up a chocolate shop and people want to stop him. That's the high-level plot. There's comedy in this, supposedly. I didn't care for any of it. I didn't laugh. I didn't find myself engaging with the comedy, despite the presence of Keegan-Michael Key, who I wanted to laugh at. He's very funny in other areas, but I don't know, man. Is it funny that a man loves chocolate so much that it starts causing him to gain a lot of weight? I don't know. I guess that's for you to decide. There's music in this movie. It is actually a musical, which I think was hidden from the marketing. But I don't think the music from this will be long-lasting in the way that the music from the original is. In fact, the big moments seem like they need to fall back on the superior songs of the original because the new ones are just so basic, meager. If you haven't seen this one and you're still wondering about it, here's a moment from the trailer that had me concerned right away. When I heard this, I cringed, and then I asked myself, will this line be a fair representation of this version of Willy Wonka and this movie as a whole? The answer is yes.
So quiet up and listen down. Nope, scratch that. Reverse it.
Number 27, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I didn't have much faith in this one, and as it turns out, I was not a fan. The first thing that caught my attention while I was watching this, and will probably catch yours, is that we get to see young, de-aged Indiana Jones in this movie, which actually looks pretty great some of the time, like when we see him for the very first time. But they missed a crucial element to this, which is the voice. He's a 30-year-old man with an 80-year-old voice, and it is noticeable.
What did you come here for?
We got a lot of nice stuff.
other people's stuff.
To the victor belongs the spoils.
To the victor.
The fact that we get an extended sequence of a young Indiana Jones is both a good thing and a bad thing. And I don't mean young Indiana Jones as in River Phoenix, or Sean Patrick Flannery for that matter. I mean de-aged CGI Harrison Ford. It's good in the fan service sense. It's what fans want to see. This era of Indiana Jones versus the Nazis, it's iconic and fun. It's classic Indiana Jones. It's the Indiana Jones that people have a warm place for in their nostalgia zone. And it's executed decently enough here, but it's bad in the sense that the rest of the movie is not what people want. I mean, I assume. It's certainly not what I want, seeing an 80-year-old man get into rough and tumble adventures. And I have a lot of respect for Harrison Ford. He's done some great things, but he really should let this horse die or let someone else ride it. We get Indy's new sidekick pals in this movie, and I could not give less of a fuck about these people, or really about much of this movie. I was really trying to figure out what about this doesn't work, and it just doesn't have the grit of the original trilogy. It's like it has no balls, and the aesthetic just feels very clean somehow compared to the first three. I feel it's more akin to Crystal Skull in the aesthetic rather than the originals. The original Indiana Jones movies are interesting because they're, in a way, trying to be like these old school action serials of the 40s. The kind of shit that would play in theaters, kids at the time would go see it. This was kind of a cool and interesting thing to see in the late 80s, like a retro throwback to an old shitty serial, but made into a budgeted full feature and made well, and made with passion and care. This is my biggest problem with Dial of Destiny, if I can put it into words. It almost seems like it's trying to do that same process of borrowing the style from an older piece of media and then repackaging it, but now it seems like it's borrowing from the original Indiana Jones movies. Like, it's trying too hard to be itself, and it lost the foundation of what it was originally somewhere along the way. If that doesn't make sense, then just know that it feels like there's a plastic layer coated right on top of this movie. And please do understand that I'm not coming from a place of like a Gen X Indiana Jones superfan that just hates anything new. I'm a pretty casual fan of this franchise, so I think with this particular IP, I'd probably be easier to please than some other people. I do like the villains of this movie. I mean, how could you not like Mads Mikkelsen? And we get Boyd Holbrook, who is a presence in his own right. I think James Mangold might really like that guy. The side characters other than them, I think, are just sometimes maybe a little too try-hard. I'll talk a little bit more about some of them in a spoiler section. But one of the big things about this movie is the ending, which is, well, it's certainly a choice. And by the ending choice, I mean where the events of the movie bring our main characters. Whether or not you find that ending set piece works, like in the framework of Indiana Jones, is up to you. I know some people do, some people don't. I hate to be this guy, but I think it's fine, I guess. My problem with this whole area of the movie are these like flip-floppy decisions that are made here. If you know the movie, you'll probably know what I mean, but a character decides, okay, we're here, and now I'm going to do X. And the audience is meant to think, what? Oh no, you can't do that. But I don't think there's a good reason for the character to even make that choice in the first place. But then a couple minutes later, another character says, no, you're actually not going to do that, and then takes away their choice, and things are just kind of reset back to normal, but except maybe everyone's learned a lesson now. But I don't feel like they have. The point of that decision was just done too quickly to tie up an arc, I guess is my point. I think there are some things to like in this movie. It does deliver the genre that it sold us. The adventure movie is such a rare thing, but this movie was not for me. Number 26, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. There's a few MCU movies in this list. Of those that I saw last year, which is all of them, this one was the worst one. Not many people like this movie. The Ant-Man movies never really have been exceptional in terms of MCU, but we're at a point in history where people judge these types of movies significantly harsher than they did prior to Avengers Endgame. I'll talk more about that later in a special segment at the end. So now, Ant-Man and his crew are in the quantum realm. In the first movie, the quantum realm is talked about like it's this nightmarish limbo, like a very frightening place where I suspect you slowly lose your mind. But in this movie, the quantum realm is just a city. Regular people live there, and some of them have regular jobs. And sure, some of them look like broccoli, but it's not that weird, it's fine. The quantum realm loses all mystique in this movie, and it looks like green screen bullshit most of the time. It's a fake place that looks fake, and unfortunately, you are there with these characters for a long time. The Ant-Man sequels have not necessarily been loved, but I think the first Ant-Man movie is at least generally liked. I know I like it well enough. The first one had the benefit of exploring the novelty of a man who can get tiny, but retain the strength of his normal-sized self. And the first one is kind of a small, fun heist movie and has a lot of cute moments with the prospect of getting small and then seeing things from the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids perspective. The Ant-Man sequels are some of my least favorite MCU movies. The second one was timed really well, so it didn't get the hate that it would have gotten if it was like released today. Ant-Man 2 came out right after Avengers Infinity War, so it was a change of pace after the epic scale of that movie, but it was also something to sit on while you anticipate the next Avengers movie, which is really what MCU fans cared about. It was a placeholder, but it was placed really well in terms of release dates. It also had a tie-in to Avengers Endgame, so I'd imagine people left that movie with a feeling of excitement. But the Ant-Man sequels just don't have that memorable factor to the same degree as the first one, with maybe a small exception in this one, which is Jonathan Majors as Kang. Kang is awesome. He is a great villain here. And this is the first time we see like the true Kang in the MCU. Jonathan Majors brings this great, sinister, and mysterious energy to this version of Kang. This actor can be very menacing, and I feel like he brings that here. In the Loki series, we got him as He Who Remains, which is an interesting variant of this character, but the true Kang has been built up, and now we see him. MCU fans knew at this point he was going to be the next big bad, and I think for many fans it gave us some hope that this guy could be like the next Thanos-level villain. This is his starting point, which delivers really well. Now let's see where it goes in the grand plan of the MCU.
Actor Jonathan Majors was just convicted of assaulting his former girlfriend. A Manhattan jury just found the 34-year-old, known for his roles in the Marvel and Creed movie franchises, guilty of assault and harassment. The charges stemmed from a dispute between Majors and Grace Jabari, who says Majors struck her in the head with his open hand, twisted her arm behind her back, and squeezed her middle finger until it...
I guess we won't be seeing where it goes after all. All right. Paul Rudd. Paul Rudd is fantastic. In this movie, yes, but also just generally. He has such a likable personality and a relatable awkwardness that I personally find endearing. He does a great job, particularly in the very beginning and at the very end of the movie with his internal monologues, before we're kind of sucked into this computer-generated quantum realm and the focus gets shifted from this guy to this place and the people in this place, and I guess to some degree the politics of this place. And there's MODOK. MODOK is in this, and MODOK is a joke. Some comic book fans were mad about this, but I've never given a shit about this guy personally. I think he should be a joke. He's a giant head with limbs, so to me he's just a clown. There's a few decent bits of comedy with him, so I think he was used appropriately enough. And Ant-Man rolls deep in this movie. There's like a whole team of Ant-Mans, which is a choice I didn't love. Evangeline Lilly is back as the Wasp. She's on the team. She must have an enemy in the hair and makeup department because we have yet another really bad hair decision with her. Michelle Pfeiffer has a pretty significant role as Janet Van Dyne, who is in a perpetual state of duck face in the movie. I don't want to say too much bad about her. She looks amazing, and she's 65. Generally speaking, I like her a lot. So with Ant-Man, when he's with the Avengers, he has some pretty niche applications of his power, which are really fantastically displayed in a movie like Captain America Civil War. But if everyone's an Ant-Man, then the novelty kind of expires. Also, he's in a tiny realm, I think. So the idea of being normal size and then getting big or small within a tiny realm raises questions that, I don't know, I don't have the scientific mind to understand. The scale of this movie is just a little bit bigger than I think it should be as well, with Ant-Man being the one to face off against Kang ultimately. I have a small comment about this showdown, but I'll save it for the spoiler section. And last thing, and it is a small thing, but this movie could have used the Michael Pena scene. He was a highlight of the other movies. His comedy was very much missed in this one. Overall, this is one of the more forgettable MCU movies, and probably one of the least good. Number 25, Scream 6. You know, I felt like when Scream 5 came out, there was some life brought back to this franchise. It was over 10 years between Screams 4 and 5, I think. I really liked the meta nature of Scream 5, the inclusion of the legacy characters, and the new characters too. Then I watched this one, and it made me consider that maybe I don't like the new characters, I just really liked Jack Quaid. Because I no longer have any attachment to the new characters in this franchise. And I said Scream 5, but I guess that one is actually just called Scream again, which is stupid. Anyway, in 2023, I saw Scream 6, and right after seeing it, I thought to myself, yeah, it's pretty good. But after sitting on it for a while, and then doing what I probably should not have done, which is rewatching some of it, yeah, I can say I don't like this movie very much. Here's one problem with these Scream movies in general, and this seems to be getting more and more noticeable. I feel like I could probably take the killer one-on-one. Ghostface, I mean. Maybe debatable if I was completely unarmed, and they totally got me by surprise, but like if, say, there was a lamp nearby, and let's be honest, there always is, I think I'd win. I am highly trained in lamp combat. But seriously, when it's revealed who the killer was, I just find myself thinking like, how much does this person weigh? And there's no way they can see well through that mask, and they're definitely gonna fall down while they're wearing those robes. But you can kind of set that aside if the movie as a whole like brings on the quality. This movie does not bring on the quality. It just brings generic people in generic slasher situations with generic reveals. And that last part is particularly important, I feel. Scream 5 had a couple good reveals, which was something that was noticeably lacking in this one. However, if you're a Scream superfan, you probably will be happy about some of the franchise Easter eggs. This movie has a lot of them. So I'm gonna hone in on some specifics here. There is one thing that I remember clearly about this movie that really bothers me, and it's that someone can get stabbed maybe 10 to 15 times in the torso and still live. You know, as long as we see them alive on the stretcher at the end of the movie and a paramedic voiceover says something like, they're gonna make it, then I guess everything's okay. I hate that shit. I know I'm sure people probably have survived being stabbed a lot in real life, but the way it's played here, I feel like the movie is lying to us. There's also a very cringy movie buff exchange that happens like somewhere in the middle of the movie, and I couldn't help but think, God, I hope that's not what I sound like. It's like they were trying to capture the cool movie geek energy of Randy from the first movie and just failed miserably. It's actually kind of embarrassing to listen to.
I hear you're a horror fan.
It's been said.
Best Nightmare on Elm Street.
The original.
Best Friday the 13th.
Part
the final
2.
chapter. I had a crush on Corey Feldman.
Okay, respect. Psycho 2 is
Underrated. Candyman. The original or equal?
Both. Okay. Okay. Game recognized game.
Game recognized game.
Now, I don't know if what I'm about to say next is considered a spoiler because it's a reveal from Scream 5, the last movie, but it's a plot point in this movie too, and it's Like, there's almost something in the bones of these new Scream movies, with this character Sam being the daughter of Billy Loomis. Billy Loomis was one of the killers from the first movie, not Matthew Lillard, he was the other one. But Sam having to resist the genetic urge to serial kill seemed like a cool concept that was introduced in 5, but is basically unused in 6. It's kind of there, but it just doesn't seem to inform any of her decisions. It really does seem like they're riding the coattails of the first movie with the inclusion of this at all because of how little it actually means. Without it, the narrative would basically be the same. This is also the first movie in the Scream franchise to not have Neve Campbell, which is lame in its own way, but it's really not the lack of Neve Campbell, Sidney, that's a problem with this movie. It's more like the filmmakers, maybe the writers specifically, just weren't trying as hard with this one as they were with 5. Because there was a big gap between 4 and 5, and probably more pressure to make something really good for like the big Scream comeback movie. If it's ever revealed that studio pressure rushed the production of this one, Scream 6, I would not at all be surprised. Scream 6 is really just a continual series of events where something happens, next thing happens, kills, finger pointing, next thing, big ending set piece, contrived character arc, and then little to no actual emotion is what you're left with. There's also no memorable kills in this one. There's no garage door death that's gonna stick with you in the end. The biggest positive, I have to say, is that I kind of did enjoy trying to figure out the who in the whodunit of it all. I don't know. I guess I'll see the next one, sure, but I think things need to take a turn in this franchise. It can't continue to be as formulaic as it was in this one. These new characters need something. We're dealing mostly now with this new generation of the Scream kids, and I just don't find myself liking them. And you know what? There's really no room for me to like them because they like themselves way too much.
But I mean, we moved here together for one very specific reason. We're a team.
We are the core fucking folk.
Thank you very much.
I
That's
hate
absolutely
myself.
right. That's what I'm talking about. It's the core four.
Say it.
No, I'm not gonna say it. Not now.
We're
I mean,
four.
yes, we're a
It's
team.
got a nice
Come
ring
on,
to
say
it.
it.
Number 24, The Exorcist Believer. I went into this movie with the lowest possible expectations due to the negative reviews. Unfortunately, I am swayed by Rotten Tomatoes a lot of the time. I know. But really poor reviews will usually steer me away from a movie. But this one was kind of a unique experience because I think it was the day before I saw this movie that I met Linda Blair in person at a convention. So seeing this right after just kind of added to the experience and made it more fun. I also got to see it in person with my regular collaborator and very good friend, review dude Josh. That was awesome. This movie is better than it appears to be. It's better than the reviews say it is, I think. One of the big problems here is that this is yet another sequel to one of the all-time great horror movies, The Exorcist. You can't help but compare it to the greatness that came before. This movie, Believer, is not one of the great horror movies by itself. So it's easy to lump this one into the same zone as the other sequels or prequels of The Exorcist and just kind of like write it off as dog shit. I do think that's slightly unfair. It has some problems. There's a very easy to pick on concept that's brought forward in this movie, and that's the concept that it's going to take the power of all the religions to join forces and complete this particular exorcism. Like they need the fucking Avengers of religions. They do try to do some of that. They have like a Catholic priest. They have a witch doctor of some kind. There's a Scientologist in there. Okay, not that one, but they don't actually get all the religions together here. They get like 2.5, so they oversell an already dumb idea, and in doing so, kind of undermine the original in a way. But the horror elements, I think, are pretty strong. Really striking images, maybe borrowing a bit from the original too hard sometimes, but I can kind of see why. That is the template, after all. The voices of the possessed children are awesome. The look of the possessed, the makeup, also awesome. I really do like the visuals that this movie gives us overall. Those kid actors did fantastic. They are scary. The movie does well in carrying this kind of ominous tone throughout the runtime, but occasionally you feel like you're pulled out of that by what I can only call small dumb ideas, some of which involve Ellen Burstyn, who returns from the original. She doesn't exactly feel necessary here, and she gets done real dirty in my opinion. So there are certainly worse Exorcist movies out there. I think this movie has been treated a bit unfairly due to legacy. But now, I'm going to toss it over to my first special guest of this episode, review dude Josh, who was kind enough to do a call-in and share his thoughts on this movie as well. Josh's review does have some slight spoilers, so if you don't want any, just skip ahead about 2 minutes and 15 seconds.
The Exorcist Believer, the sequel to one of the most well-known and beloved horror films of all time. 2013's concert movie Justin Bieber, Believer. Okay, so the latest entry in the Exorcist series that has just too many goddamn entries comes to us from Blumhouse Pictures this time around. And can I just say, did anyone ask for this movie? Anyone at all? Did you? I didn't ask for this shit, but it did allow me to meet Linda Blair, so that's an absolute win in my books. But let's talk about the movie itself. Right off the bat, the positives. First, I think the two child stars did a fabulous job, all things considered. Two, again, I met Linda Blair. Alright, the negatives. The first and obvious that stood out to me was this does not feel like a sequel to The Exorcist. You might not have noticed it,
But your brain did.
this looks and feels and operates like a fucking Conjuring sequel to me. And wouldn't you know it, both are produced by Blumhouse.
You might not have even noticed. But your brain did.
So shit like the priest getting his neck 360 no-scope felt like a cheap kill from one of the other 347 exorcism movies that come out each and every year. Or when the mom from the original got her eyes poked out. It felt like schlock from 2006. Also, I kept thinking she looked like Neo from the third Matrix movie and Kenshi from Mortal Kombat. That didn't help. Another big thing I take issue with is the We Are the World of Exorcisms that takes place in the finale. When the dad started recruiting different religions to partake in this rap battle, it made me feel things I never knew I could feel. Mostly bad things. Reason 37. There's fucking magic in this universe now. There's magic in this Exorcist sequel. Finally, and the last thing that absolutely left a bad taste in my mouth is the ending. They try to do this symbolic irony of choosing which person lives and which person dies.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
But they fucked it up. Not only did one of the innocent little girls die for absolutely no reason, she was also dragged to hell by Satan himself. And that's a bit over the line in my opinion. Now, as I understand it, this is part one in a planned trilogy. So let me know if those other two have already been canceled. And that's why I'm giving this movie 5 fucked up little girls out of 10.
Thank you, Josh. Number 23, The Little Mermaid. I said it once and I'll say it again. James Cameron has ruined underwater photography for everyone at this point. He perfected it with Avatar 2, and anything else is going to be visually inferior, and that includes Disney's latest live-action adaptation of one of their classic animated movies, The Little Mermaid. I don't know why, but this movie feels like it was a million years ago. It was released in May of 2023, a movie with controversy right out of the gate. You know, woke, 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 woke. To me, really just a meaningless word that seems to be like interchangeable for a lot of different scenarios. And look, I'm totally okay with film criticism, clearly, but one word just doesn't seem like enough to cover so many different scenarios, many of which probably have their own levels of nuance. So I just don't see it as a valid one-size-fits-all complaint, but whatever. If that's your hang-up, you do you, man. Ariel is black. Halle Bailey. No relation. To me, that actually kind of fit perfectly with the Caribbean environment where this movie takes place. Ariel has sisters that are different races because they come from different seas around the world. There's like an Asian one, a white one. One of them might be Jewish, I don't know. But these choices do seem to have a story reason. And this movie is also a musical, much like Wonk, but what this one has going to its benefit is that it's basically the same movie as the animated version, so they kind of already have these classic beloved songs like In the Chamber. Halle Bailey is pretty incredible in her musical performances, namely like in the main song of the movie, Part of This World. At least I think that's the main song, but she can sing it. She's great. That being said, there's a song called Scuttlebutt, which actress Awkwafina sings, and the word sings is being used very loosely here. It's one of the worst fucking things I've ever heard in my life.
Hey, wake up, wake up, wake up!
What?
Hey, have you not heard that scuttlebutt?
Your butt.
No, the gossip, the buzz, the who said what, who does that, yeah, the scuttlebutt. Well, I was flying over land and sea and ear to the ground. Then I came flying here for you to see and hear what I found. Remember the swamp? Remember my song in the swamp? And I was like, whap, chicka, whap, whap, chicka, whap.
I remember.
Well, ever since, the what's his name, the guy with the hair and the shirt?
The prince.
Yeah, the prince has been dropping hints. He wants to, you know when humans dress all nice like they're penguins? Throw rice for the pigeons. They're trying to blow up the pigeons, but those are just urban legends. I know a lot of really fat.
Good God, man. I'm fairly certain this is a wholly original song for this version of The Little Mermaid, but if it was in the original, I must have blocked that out as some kind of traumatic childhood memory. I did not think I would like this movie, and don't get me wrong, I don't love it, but I do think it's alright. The bones are already there, and they don't do what they did with like Mulan and make it the same movie but add on 3 extra layers of really dumb shit. Most of the casting actually works out really well for these characters. Melissa McCarthy as Ursula is literally the perfect choice. There's also a guy named Art Malik in this movie who plays Sir Grimsby. I might get his exact title wrong, but he's like some kind of politician that's often hanging around with Prince Eric and helping him out with whatever. This is the actor that played Lord Belasco in A Kid in King Arthur's Court. And he's kind of like in a similar position here with the royalty, and I just found that pretty funny and maybe kind of personally distracting. But he's not the villain in this. He's like Lord Belasco if he was good instead of evil. So anyway, shout out to Art Malik, the OG Lord Elastic. The animal companions in this movie look like real animals, which is weird. Flounder is an abomination to behold because he looks like a disgusting fucking fish. He's not cute. He's actually pretty gross. And the bird Scuttle looks weirdly threatening. And speaking of the look, these live-action Disney remakes, they have like a look. I know earlier I talked about the underwater scenes and how they aren't ideal, but it's not just that. There's an artificial look to some of these that seems to be recurring in the Disney live-action remakes. And then there's Prince Eric. He's just kind of a boring guy. He probably always was, though. I don't remember the original well enough to say. The one thing I want to say about this guy is that he has his own song. I looked it up and the song is called Wild Uncharted Waters. I think this is another case of the song being wholly original for this movie. But my comment is more about the scene in which he's singing rather than the song itself. The scene reminds me of a Creed music video. And I actually replayed this scene, but muted, and then I played Creed over it, and I was laughing at that quite a lot for quite a while. Maybe I'll put that on YouTube. But I think the biggest problem with this one is that it's pretty engaging in the moment, but really has no staying power. As this one sits in your mind for any length of time, it kind of starts to degrade in quality. It's like reverse Independence Day. So The Little Mermaid is a decent watch in the moment, but ultimately forgettable. Number 22, Fast X. Something family. Okay, let's get into it. The family is split up this time. I'm pretty sure that was part of this movie's initial elevator pitch. Like, what if this time the big bad villain scatters Dom's team and goes after Dom's son, as well as the other people he cares about. So on a high level, very slightly different than the last few, I guess. I am of the opinion that the separation of Dom from his team is this movie's biggest flaw, because it really highlights that the lead character of this franchise, Dom Toretto, is the most uninteresting charisma vacuum of a character when he's by himself. Dante is the villain of this movie, played by Jason Momoa, and he is absolutely the highlight. And he injects some much needed personality into this series. He's an insane, flamboyant, basically Joker guy. I know I'm not the first person to make that comparison, but that is absolutely what I said coming out of the theater. He's doing his version of the Joker. And good. The super assassin thing is played out, and he does have shades of that, but his comedically evil charm makes up for some of those more stale tropes that come along with the typical villains of this franchise. It kind of supersedes those characteristics. Speaking of, not only has this franchise collected a bunch of actors like Gal Gadot, Jason Statham, Kurt Russell, Charlize Theron, Scott Eastwood, and John Cena as the years have gone on, but this installment adds Jason Momoa, Alan Ritchson, also known as Reacher, and Brie Larson. So there's a lot going on here. I will say that John Cena finally gets some personality to his character, aside from spiteful stoicism, which is what we got from him in Fast 9. He's quite a bit more fun here, albeit he's playing up the more traditional John Cena / Peacemaker kind of role. So I like to hone in on specific moments, and one of the silliest of this movie, speaking as a fan here, is when Han and the group he's marooned with make their way over to Jason Statham, aka Shaw. And I'm gonna have to set this one up a bit, actually. So Fast 9, the previous movie, it has a post-credit scene where Han knocks on a door, and who answers this door? Shaw, Jason Statham, who is understandably surprised because he killed Han at the end of 6, or so he thought. So Han knocks on his door, and in Fast 9, where this happens, Han has short hair. So someone made the horrible decision of giving him short hair in Fast 9, which is the movie where Han was revealed to not actually be dead. So Shaw answers the door, his eyes go wide, post-credit stinger, what's gonna happen? Why is Han knocking on Shaw's door? Now in this movie, they set up the events that lead to Han knocking on that door, which is essentially just Han and his crew have to go to Shaw for help. But in this movie, Han has long hair again, right? He has the traditional Han look. So what do they do about this hair length continuity problem? Ignoring it would probably be fine, right? Well, they have Han inexplicably put his hair behind his ears before knocking, so it appears that he has shorter hair. Something I'm pretty sure he has never done before and was a specific choice just to maintain hair continuity. Wow. Just bravo, Of all the things that don't make sense in this series, this is the one they felt needed answering. I am both ironically and unironically a fan of this franchise. I think Fast 5 is genuinely a great action movie. If you haven't seen it, watch it. If you want some bare minimum familiarity before watching it, watch the first one and the fourth one. But I'm here to say, in all honesty, there have been diminishing returns since Fast 5. But Fast 5 bought a lot of goodwill, at least a decade of it, but again, diminishing returns. Right? 6 was a step down, but it was pretty good. 7 was decent, but it kind of lives strong with fans because of the emotional pull with the Paul Walker situation and how that played into the movie. 8 had a decent premise, but just really didn't deliver enough on it. It does have a very memorable action scene, though, with Jason Statham, where he's rescuing a baby. 9 is not a good movie, but it's unhinged, and it goes way off the rails with some stuff. They drive a car into space in 9. Also, Cardi B rescues Dom from certain doom at one point. Cardi B. That movie is fucking batshit, which is funny, but the movie is still pretty bad. This one, It has Momoa, who is awesome, but it's kind of bordering self-parody at this point. Very noticeably so, even in the first act, with the initial family barbecue. Like, it feels silly, it feels weird, it feels stiff, and as far as I know, Vin Diesel wasn't even feuding with the other actors this time, so it really has no excuse for feeling that awkward. There's a big Rome set piece with a bomb rolling down a hill for 15 minutes. That scene had its moments, which fit neatly into what this franchise is, but it's mostly overshadowed by the absurdity. And I found myself just really focusing on this hill, like this never-ending hill that leads right to the fucking Vatican. Under these conditions, a snowball could be a very serious threat to Vatican City. Also, something I find hilarious is that on YouTube, you can watch part of that scene, and the title of the video on YouTube is Dom Saves the Vatican. What the fuck? Did Vin Diesel upload that and name it? If you're a fan of this franchise in any way, this movie is worth a watch for the villain. The story is decent enough in theory as well, but it's the little in-between moments where this movie suffers. Some of that, maybe a lot of it, is when Vin Diesel is on his own. He is a boring man. Some of it is when Ramsey, Roman, and Tej and Han are doing their own thing separately. Those moments are pretty hard to get through. With them, it's just like a series of the worst hand-fisted comedy you've ever seen, technobabble, worst comedy you've ever seen, technobabble, etc. This one only holds the rating that it does because I kind of have an attachment to this franchise. If I didn't, it would be lower. So I'll leave it at that for now and talk more about this one in the spoiler section, because I will say, even though I think this is not a very good movie, there might be some hope for the future. Number 21, Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. What a title. For some reason, this movie has been the toughest one for me to speak on, so I apologize if this one isn't as fleshed out as some of the other major movies of 2023. Here's my hot take. I am of the opinion that we've hit the point where we're starting to see diminishing returns with this series too, kind of like the Fast franchise, but not nearly as egregious. I had a pretty high level of excitement and anticipation for this movie. I really wanted to like this movie as much as I have liked Mission Impossibles 3 through 6, but unfortunately I just didn't. And this isn't a bad movie by any means, it's just not one I found myself enjoying very much, unfortunately. In this movie, like many before it, Tom Cruise as Ethan Hunt and his team of IMF agents, they have to save the world. And I really can't say what the threat here is exactly without getting into spoiler territory, but it is an interesting concept. It's kind of a cool take. The problem that I have here is that the movie, as it went on, just really didn't generate much enthusiasm from me, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly why that is. There are things that I like about this. I like the backstory setup at the very beginning of the movie. It's a very cool kind of Hunt for Red October thing going on with a neat little twist at the end. And I'm probably going to end up bullet pointing a lot of the things worth talking about for this one, like the Italy tiny car chase scene. I wanted to like that scene more than I did, and it did have some creativity that was unique to this particular chase scene, but it eventually fell into the rut of just action movie chase scene. And the jokes during that chase scene ranged between somewhat amusing and really god-awful. I'm personally not the type that gets very excited about a car chase scene in a spy movie, so a lot of the disinterest was probably just my personal taste. There's the big train action scene. There's some really good elements there and some good suspense at times, but it goes on for too long, and I never felt like it had a big enough gratifying moment within this extended sequence to kind of forgive that. There were certainly moments that this movie considered to be big, but I just wasn't on the same level. And speaking of big, the big stunt of the movie was cool, but it was also overhyped. I saw the behind the scenes of that stunt in the preview section of every movie I went to for months leading up to it. It really took away some of the wow factor. These kind of scenes probably should not be in the marketing at all, so you can get the thrill of them for the first time when you're actually watching the movie. They're just kind of like putting out on the first date by doing it this way. And then there's the use of sleight of hand in this movie, which is just excessive. I guess it kind of always is in movies or TV shows, but you know what I mean, right? When a character bumps into another character in a show or movie, it's usually because there's like some pickpocketing of some kind going on. And that whole thing is just like super typical. And it happens in this movie a lot. So let me talk side characters for a moment. Hayley Atwell is a great addition to this movie. Her character is used in such a way that actually fleshes out the IMF. And that's kind of a good choice. But with this, I think they're kind of rewriting history a little bit with the lore of the IMF, but that's more of a feeling. I actually didn't go back and watch the older Mission Impossible movies to see if that's true or not. There's also Pom Klementif. She's in this. She's a pretty cool villain henchman named Paris. Maybe a tad stereotypical in the kind of smile while they stab you, chaotic evil department. But there's a small thing with this character and the primary antagonist that was a nice touch. There's this kind of like self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of her allegiance. I don't think they spend enough time exploring that, but maybe those ideas are going to be left for part 2. This kind of concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy as it relates to this particularly unique villain that's behind the scenes making things happen. Paris, also has this narrow corridor fight scene with Ethan, which is great in concept, but shaky as all hell in execution. Like, it's literally shaky. You might get motion sickness from watching this scene. And it's even more noticeable than it should be because the movie continually cuts back to another action scene at the same time that's perfectly steady. And then we have a few returning classics. Ving Rhames, Simon Pegg, Rebecca Ferguson, and Vanessa Kirby. Still no Jeremy Renner comeback, but everyone that is here is good. Vanessa Kirby gets some especially unique scenes where she gets to kind of showcase her skills as an actor. And then there's Simon Pegg and Ving Rhames. The character dynamic between them and Tom Cruise / Ethan Hunt is kind of just down to a science at this point. It's really great. Rebecca Ferguson's character Ilsa ends up in a situation that I don't think would have played out the way it did play out in the movie. If you've seen this movie, you know what I mean, but I just didn't buy what happened to her. It seemed like with her character, the situation would have ended up the other way around. Anyway, with this one, I know my thoughts are kind of short and bullet pointed, but for me, this movie was okay at best and bland at worst. There were certainly elements I liked about this movie, elements I found to be good, but I don't think there were many that I found to be great. I think this might be what the kids would call mid. I will stick with this franchise and watch Dead Reckoning Part 2, but I just felt a bit unfulfilled with this one, which sucks because I wanted to love it. Number 20, Napoleon. Or as I have been calling it, Ridley Scott's hit piece on Napoleon Bonaparte. First, the positive. I'd say the biggest positive with this one is the battle scenes. Top tier Ridley Scott war scenes at times. Grand scale, brutal, epic, all of that. And there's a very memorable moment involving a cannonball, which even rivals Roland Emmerich's The Patriot for cannonball kills in cinema. I did love a lot of the war action in this. And the movie can be cinematic as fuck when it chooses to be. There are times when you really feel the scale of this movie, particularly during a wartime campaign. And that's what we signed up for with this movie as an audience. But the epic war battles aside, this movie can be dumb and weird, separately. One thing that falls into the dumb category, and it is a small thing, but it's right before the first big wartime battle of the movie, Napoleon is wearing his iconic hat. But he's wearing it the other way, like he's wearing it narrow as opposed to wide. But before the battle starts, he rotates that bad boy into the classic position. Like, yeah, it's on, baby. Napoleon time is happening now. Little stuff like that will really make me groan, and it's just the kind of shit that I'll never forget about a movie. But there's quite a few things in this movie that are dumb, and that's not the only one. That one is small. A lot of these points have been talked about to death in reviews and just common discussion on the movie, but a glaring one is the accents. There's really no French accents used, which could be fine, I guess, if it were only French people in the movie. But they interact with people from other countries sometimes, and their accents are the same. And then Joaquin's accent is just basic non-regional American, which clashes with the other people who are supposed to be from the same part of the world as him, but have British accents. It is noticeably distracting in a way that I didn't expect it to be. I normally do not get hung up on like the accents thing. I've also heard that this movie is historically inaccurate, which I know very little about, but apparently that made people unhappy. French people, I assume. Their lives are hard enough as it is. But as for the weird side, the weird stuff in this movie is Napoleon's sex life. Why is this such a major component to the story? Do people care about this? Do people find it interesting? I am highly skeptical that some of the specifics displayed in these areas of the movie can in any way be historically accurate. There's just no way some of this weird-ass fucking behavior is documented. Which is kind of why I described this as Ridley Scott's hit piece on Napoleon. There just seems to be great efforts taken to make this man look bad. And yeah, maybe he was a real piece of shit and a creep, but in the case of Napoleon, I'm not sure that makes a compelling movie. The common idea of Napoleon as a historical figure is that he was a great military strategist. We get very little of that. The filmmakers have elected to not make that the focus. The movie could have been Napoleon. Look at him. He's such a great strategist. Here's how he did it. Here's the planning. Here's the execution. Here's the results. And then, here are his flaws as a person. I would like to think that was the original plan. But if so, the focus of this movie was shifted in the writing, or the writing is intentionally trying to undermine that part of Napoleon and just basically say, yeah, he had some decent strategies, but really they were just kind of common sense battle tactics, and he failed more than he succeeded. Like, the movie doesn't state that, but it leaves you with that impression. I might be giving Ridley Scott a hard time here unfairly because he didn't actually write this movie, but as the director, it's ultimately your movie, so you take the shit flinging, my friend. I like what they're doing here at times, I really do, but at nearly 3 hours, the movie needed more of what Ridley Scott does best. So, pretty good, it's okay, but if you're looking for a historically accurate depiction, then maybe just watch Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Oh, behold! He ate the pig, thus proving that he's a Ziggy Piggy, Ziggy Piggy, Ziggy Piggy.
Number 19, Killers of the Flower Moon. The latest Martin Scorsese movie is about 1920s Oklahoma, the Osage Native American people, money, and murder. Lots and lots of murder. First, this is a great-looking movie. Scorsese does a fantastic job of really just transporting you back to this time and place in history. You might not think about it while you're watching it, but for me, I thought about it a lot afterward. I thought about how incredible of a feat it is to make a period piece that 100% looks and feels like this actual time in history, and to do so with little to no noticeable CGI. The movie also has incredible performances. The star of this movie is Leonardo DiCaprio. I really love this actor. I think he's one of the greatest ever. To his face, man, in this movie. He's a true actor because he puts on this face, this like frown mug face that looks like the angry video game nerd. Like he looks like a sad face emoji a lot of the time in this movie. Just Google search Killers of the Flower Moon, Leonardo DiCaprio, and you'll see several images displaying exactly what I'm describing here. And then when he's not making that face, he's probably grinning at the thought of money, and you can see his teeth, and those teeth are fucked up. It's a bit of a departure from your more typical handsome man Leo role. He's kind of putting himself out there in a way by playing someone this gross, And not just gross in the teeth department, but in his behavior. He has such a scumbag smile and a scumbag way, and then the teeth will creep through the smile, and it really just helps sell what a piece of shit this character is. A lot of the characters in this movie are just despicable, complete scumfucks. The story is actually a really great insight to the events of that time and place that I personally knew nothing about. And it sets the stage in a great way early on with this old-timey newsreel to kind of establish where we are and what's happened. It does something similar near the end too, but I didn't find myself loving that part as much, the ending version of it. I was a little bit distracted by the eyebrows there. A lot of the side characters we see in this movie have this very real feel to them. It's like the kind of thing you see in a Safdie Brothers movie, except in this case, they also seem like they fit perfectly in this time period, like they were just plucked right out of 1922 or whatever it is. One of the side characters is a guy named Blackie Thompson, and don't lose your shit, he's not actually black. The actor's name is Tommy Schultz. He has no other credits to his name, but he is perfect here as just this greasy-ass dude getting up to some greasy-ass shit. I also mentioned how there's a lot of murder here. Those moments feel very Scorsese in all the right ways. It's like abrupt brutality that's just very cold and emotionless. And I feel like there's a very specific sound to a gunshot in a Scorsese movie. And of course, we get a few of those here. So here's my problem with this movie, and here's why it's not ranked higher. It is long. Fuck, it's long. This is 3 hours and 26 minutes, and I am normally not the guy to make this kind of complaint, but it is too goddamn long. Usually I like a long movie, as long as it doesn't waste time. I think this movie does end up wasting a little bit of time as we go through it. There is greatness within this story, within the performances, the filmmaking, but the movie can be unnecessarily slow. And I think this would probably be more digestible as something like a miniseries. Also, this is one of the movies I saw last year where the presentation was interrupted. There was a fire alarm pulled about 2 hours into this movie at the theater I went to. So Alan and Steve go out the fire exit doors, and I made the fucking mistake of following them, and we quickly got lost like in the bowels of this mall. It took us a while to find our way out, and eventually we made our way back to the theater, back to the auditorium, and then eventually they started the movie around the area that it was cut off. This was just a fucking pain in the ass, but not Martin Scorsese's fault, sure. But back to the acting, it really is top tier. I don't think I've hated a Robert De Niro character in a movie this much since like Cape Fear. Lizzie Q is an actress that's not talked about enough, but she's a legendary Native American actress. Brendan Fraser is here, and he's fucking back, and he's better than ever these days. And also, Eldon Henson makes an appearance in a part so small you probably missed it. He is, of course, known for his iconic role of Fulton Reed in the Mighty Ducks franchise. What an icon. One half of the Bash Brothers. So anyway, this is certainly a good movie and worth a watch if you have a lot of free time. But a movie I could see getting the dreaded label of boring, which is a word I hate to use when describing a movie. I try not to overuse it, but I could see how some people might use that for this one. So this is probably not a movie I'll revisit, but it is a movie I'm glad I saw. And now I'm going to give the floor to my next special guest of the evening, who was nice enough to do a call-in, Pappy Malcolm, aka the Blackie Thompson of the Spoilers Podcast.
Hey, this is Pappy from Spoilers Podcast, guest starring here to discuss one of my favorite movies of the year, 2023's Killers of the Flower Moon, starring Brendan Fraser, Jesse Plemons, John Lithgow, and of course, soon-to-be Oscar winner at the time of this recording, Lily Gladstone. I think the first thing that I want to talk about is not directly related to this movie, but how much of a moment David Gran had in 2023. Korey, you may recognize that name from Lost City of Z, which he wrote and was adapted into a movie we both like, But not only did Killers of the Flower Moon come out, the movie version, he also had a New York Times #1 bestseller, The Wager, which is going to be Martin Scorsese's next movie. And I haven't read any of those books yet. I did download the audiobook for Killers of the Flower Moon today, and it's about 9 hours, which is really only like 2 movie Killers of the Flower Moon, because this is an extremely long movie. It's 3.5 hours long, but I would say it doesn't feel like it's 3.5 hours long. And I'm just gonna quickly run down some of the things that I love about this movie. First and foremost, it looks fucking amazing. Martin Scorsese has a couple of his classic tracking shots that he has going through the Osage homes. The Oklahoma landscape films beautifully. I really wish I would have seen this on the big screen. There's a couple times too where characters are covered in oil and it looks great, contrasted against some of like the brown of the Oklahoma fields. It looks amazing. Love that about it. My favorite shot though is actually an indoor one that was in a Masonic temple where Leonardo DiCaprio gets spanked by Robert De Niro. I don't want to give too much away in spoilers. This isn't spoilers, but that whole sequence just looks incredible. Like the way the camera's positioned, the way the room looks ginormous, the way that Leo's like presented down, like bent over to be spanked. I fucking love that part. So, looks amazing. Speaking of Leo, his teeth in this movie are truly incredible. I thought he had a great performance. He's kind of playing this dumb guy who's getting caught up in things in many ways. He's definitely an evil person, but time and time again, his intelligence is being called out by characters, and ultimately in the end, where he's being swept up in everything, you don't feel bad for him, but it's a great performance. And finally, Lily Gladstone's performance, she deserves that Oscar. The grief that her character goes through, and even like from that to the opening chemistry that she has with Leo, just a truly breakout performance. Can't wait to see her speech on Oscar night. De Niro is also awesome in this movie. I mentioned him briefly there, but an evil Pappy character here in Oklahoma. Loved his accent throughout the movie. There's one part early in the movie where they're all laughing maniacally while he's doing a bird impression that I just laughed out loud at because it's so ridiculous.
Blackbird talk. Beep, 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 beep.
Beep, 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 beep. Blackbird talk.
Beep, beep, beep.
And the last thing that I want to mention is the score. Robbie Robertson, Scorsese's buddy from The Band, really tied the movie together because it sounds like this mix of almost a 60s Western, like it could be like Red Dead Redemption music with Native American traditional music. And it is that blending of the cultures that's encapsulated in the music, which is a huge theme of the movie. So yeah, Pappy from Spoilers, Killers of the Flower Moon, one of 2023's best.
Number 18, The Creator. First thing with this one is that Pappy and I did a full podcast on this movie shortly after it came out on the Spoilers podcast. You can check out episode 479 of Spoilers to hear a more in-depth discussion over there. So, the latest Gareth Edwards science fiction movie is The Creator. Gareth Edwards is the man that is the credited director on Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, and he also did the 2014 Godzilla movie. Maybe we'll talk more about Godzilla later. The Creator is about a dystopian future where humans and humanoid AI coexist here on Earth, but relations are not too good. And in the USA, the AI are straight up banned. And there's one man who is an American agent of sorts, Joshua, played by John David Washington, and he has to go on a journey with the AI's secret weapon, who happens to be a cute little AI kid. So you know what it is. It's a lone wolf and cub story, and aren't they oh so popular right now? The Creator is really creative. This is its strength. It's an original story, and you can't help but applaud the world building you see in this movie. It feels big because the locations we see in this movie feel like they have a history. Some of the overall history you learn about in the introductory exposition, but more important than that is like the sense of the world as you go through it during their journey. If that part is done correctly, you'll get a real good sense of a fleshed out setting, and it totally delivers in that respect here. The effects, which we talked about can hinder a movie, are incredible in this one and absolutely elevate the movie. The creator actually only had an $80 million budget, and for perspective, that's less than half of the budget they had for some of the other effects-heavy movies I talked about earlier, like Aquaman 2 and Transformers 7, which had $215 million and $195 million budgets, respectively. So in this, the AI humanoids just have this fantastic look, where you can see their mechanical parts and how they blend in with the human parts, and it's perfectly seamless. They have both the human and artificial look, and it's nearly flawless, but also kind of unsettling to see. All of the visuals in this are really just a spectacle. There's a lot of time spent in Asia, where most of the AIs are, and you see these like cool ancient ruins that have been integrated with technology, and they're in these beautiful isolated settings which look great. There's also a kind of Blade Runner portion of the movie in terms of the setting, where we get to see what a large city looks like, and you learn some of the customs of the society and what it's like in that type of environment as opposed to the rural environment, which is where we spend a lot of time. This world is just beautiful, albeit kind of a nightmarish hellscape to some that live there. But those are the things that come to mind when I think about this movie, the stunning visuals and the abundant world. The story for this is probably just a little bit too basic. Some of the characters are very one note, and the story doesn't deliver anything other than what you expect and foresee. I'll say that this movie is quite predictable, and it seems to have some very James Cameron energy in the story, but not exactly in the right ways. Like more in the safest possible ways. But also you can't help but draw connections to the Terminator movies with the inclusion of AI and the human's relationship to it. And then there's a certain, shall we say, explosion at the beginning of the movie. I do feel like this is a good movie, but when I think back and focus on the story side, I find myself getting hung up on like what could have been here. There could have and maybe should have been greater efforts to like emotionally invest you in the drama outside of like the very easy narrative choices they go with. For example, there's a great moment in this movie that goes by very quickly. It's a scene in a factory where there's these AI robots and they're being junked. And there's like hundreds of them in this giant industrial trash compactor, and they're desperately trying to crawl out before they're crushed. A moment like that works because it gives you like an emotional tug. It's disturbing, sure, but it's also kind of conflicting. And I think like a brief but haunting visual like that makes you kind of consider mortality in the context of this universe. It does more than just add shock value, but that scene is very brief and the movie needed more scenes like that throughout. I just think we needed more non-dialogue driven world-building moments to ponder on. A movie that takes itself as seriously as this one and is kind of intended to create this mixed feeling between the relationship of humans and AI, it needs some darkness. It needs more grim moments that remind you that even though we're following the lone wolf and the cute AI kid, this world is bleak and we never want you to forget that. Now, I'm not saying this movie never tries to convey that, but it doesn't get as bleak as it should have, in my opinion. I think another thing the creator needed was a big revelation of some kind in the story. I know there was like a kind of reveal in this movie, but it needed something bigger, something less predictable, and something that kind of just leaves the audience thinking, okay, that's it. Like, I don't think we're left with any real sense of gratification when it comes to both the reveals and the character arcs in this movie, because you really do spot them a mile away. And I think the ending should have left you with the feeling that you have at a movie like Arrival. Call it a twist if you want, but something that takes you by surprise and gives you that same kind of wow factor, which is what you get in a movie like Arrival. Anyway, back to the positives for this one. The tech in this movie is great. It's a future of some kind, so the technology that's presented in this movie is different than what we have now, of course. But it's showcased very effectively during some battle scenes. There's a tank that feels like it's right out of the old game StarCraft. It's massive and just badass. There's these really neat armored kamikaze robots that just kind of rush into enemy lines and they basically have a bomb strapped to their back. And then, of course, there's the Death Star-like super weapon, which is epic and terrifying. The power of this super weapon is displayed in the movie in a very Rogue One fashion. No surprise there, I suppose. And the might of the American military is just really overwhelming and scary here. And you see it from the perspective of those feeling its wrath a lot of time, which adds to the effect. And then there's another small kind of sci-fi element with the ability to download a consciousness after death and kind of upload it temporarily to an AI form. It's very D&D, like Speak to the Dead, if you're familiar. Things like that do a lot for the sci-fi world of it all. Think about something like The Fifth Element, which you may or may not like, but knowing my audience, you probably like it. But that movie and the story aside, think about that cool-ass fucking gun that Gary Oldman has. The Zorg ZF-1. Slight, handles adjustable for easy carrying, good for righties and lefties, breaks down into 4 parts, undetectable by X-ray, ideal for quick, discreet interventions. You know the one, right? Unique and creative sci-fi elements, even if they're not used to a large degree, I think will stick with you when they're executed well. You'll remember those things for years after seeing a movie, and this movie brings some of those. And my last thing for this one, the Hans Zimmer score is so cool. It's actually really great. Hans Zimmer is a legend. There's really nothing else to say about him. He did a great job here. So in general filmmaking, this movie is a sight to behold and just a marvel. In terms of story, it's disappointing but not awful. It just bums me out a bit that this movie could have been one of the great sci-fi movies, but it was hindered by story choices. I do still recommend watching it though. Number 17, The Marvels. Unlike some other movies that I'll be talking about later, it seemed that this movie was immediately hated, like well before it was released. The internet was just against this movie, and the movie did not end up doing well financially. The Marvels is a sequel to the 2019 movie Captain Marvel, but this time it also includes Kamala Khan from the Disney Plus series Miss Marvel and Monica Rambeau from the Disney Plus series WandaVision. It's kind of like a sequel to all of those. So to fully understand this one, I guess you do have to have done a little bit of homework, and maybe that's a contributing factor to the financial failure of this, but I think this movie is pretty good. I can already feel the internet wanting to kill me for some of my takes on this list. I'm sorry. This movie is fun, and that is the most succinct way I can describe how I feel about this one. Like I said, overall I do like this movie. The story sucks, but the movie still comes together in a pretty enjoyable way. So Captain Marvel has to team up with Monica Rambeau and Kamala Khan to stop a bad guy. Easy superhero plot. Bada bing, bada boom. Now, there's a little bit of a twist on this because the three of them get into a mess where their superpowers become entangled. And what that means is that sometimes when one of them activates their superpower, it will kind of randomly switch them with one of the other two. Like even if they're very far away on another planet, like they'll teleport and switch locations. So they're very often accidentally switching places with each other. And sometimes they kind of have to fall back on fighting without the use of superpowers because of that. I think the idea with this was probably to like nerf Captain Marvel, who in the context of the MCU is basically like their version of Superman, power-wise. But what real threat can someone this powerful have without introducing like a kryptonite of some kind? So I think the initial idea with this movie was to probably bring in something that will limit Captain Marvel's abilities. But what they do with that, what's done with this whole entanglement thing, makes for some very inventive action scenes. The first time we see one of those is about 20 minutes into the movie or so, and it's an incredible scene. It involves all three of the heroes who haven't really figured out why this is happening and aren't even fully aware of each other yet. And they're fighting some villain henchmen in this just wonderfully chaotic and imaginative action set piece that takes us to these 3 different locations. They're bouncing between them. They kind of appear in one, and before they know what's going on, they're getting dogpiled. And then they switch to a new place, and they're kind of rescuing the civilians that are involved, and it's just glorious. Honestly, I think this might be one of the best action scenes in the MCU. It's about 3 minutes long, and at the time of this recording, the full clip isn't even on YouTube. They only have some cut down versions there, so if you want to see it, you'll have to pull it up on Disney+. Big props and all the credit in the world to the choreography and the planning that went into making this scene. This kind of instant and unexpected teleportation thing that's happening between the 3 of them really allowed the filmmakers to have some fun with the action. Like, you feel that level of fun while you're watching it. I think it's easy to shit on Marvel, and it's easy to shit on Disney, but sometimes they make something great, and that deserves recognition too. This action scene is great, and I think it deserves all the recognition. And speaking of shitting on Disney and Marvel, like I said, the story for this one is not good. It's about as basic as Marvel gets. Like, if you had a gun, and you pointed it at my toy collection, and you said, "Tell me the name of the villain in this movie or I'll shoot," I'd say, "Hey, point the gun at me and leave the street sharks out of this, okay, buddy?" No, but seriously, I don't know the villain's fucking name in this movie. It's a weak story. The villain is like portaling air and water away from whole planets, sending it back to her home planet because whatever. I don't know. I'm going to be a little bit of an apologist here and say actually that the plot doesn't matter too much for this movie. This movie is definitely about the journey, as corny as that sounds. It's really about the time we spend with these 3 characters and how much they grow together and how they adapt to this kind of unique situation involving their superpowers. In fact, there's a really entertaining and pretty endearing montage scene with the 3 of them getting used to this like switching places thing, and they're practicing how they're going to handle it. And then later in the movie, they put that into use, and it's just awesome to see. I called this movie fun earlier, and what I mean by that is that there's some good to great action scenes, some endearing characters, namely Kamala Khan and her family, and some kind of just off-the-wall shit that mostly works here because it mostly maintains this very lighthearted approach. One example of this is a planet where the 3 main characters visit, and the form of communication on this planet is singing. So the movie goes into like musical mode for a few minutes, and the movie's tone is really just light enough for this to work. It's pretty cute too, and honestly, it's kind of a brave decision because that could have easily been the cringiest shit I've ever seen. And hey, maybe to some of you it was, but to me, that kind of works within the context of this kind of silly adventure they're on. I really like the idea, actually, that in one particular planet in the galaxy, Captain Marvel happens to be a Disney princess. Okay, last couple small points. Kamala Khan's family is really great in this. They're very funny and are not typical to a movie like this. You generally just don't see a lot of Muslim superheroes, or in this case, Muslim families involved in a movie like this. So their antics are kind of fun, but I gotta say that the family as a whole plays better in the Ms. Marvel series because there's more time to spend with them. They're more of a focus in that series. And then there's another thing in this movie, which I don't think I can describe fully without going into spoiler territory, but it involves cats, and it was way overplayed. They made this like cat situation a plot point in the 3rd act. I don't know, it was kind of stupid because the cat's ability, like what they do only works if they don't overuse it. Because if they overuse it, then the audience will start to realize that it doesn't make any sense. I don't know, they just kind of crossed over this thin line of cute and stupid with that one, and I think it fell deep into the stupid territory. There is a mid-credits scene in this movie, which I'll talk about in the spoiler section at the very end. So I'll just say that overall, this is a very fun movie. As I said, it's not without its story problems, but I think those are easily forgivable with the tone this movie wants to set and the vibes that it leaves you with. Number 16, John Wick Chapter 4. The John Wick series is generally fantastic as a rule. I, like many, was blown away by the first John Wick movie, and I've gone to the theater to see all the sequels, but I have lost some interest in the franchise as time has gone on. Now, I don't think that the John Wick movies are diminishing in the same way that like Mission Impossible might be, or the Fast movies definitely are. But I will say that after what the lead character has survived in previous movies, I think the stakes of John Wick have taken a hit. But let me go positive for a moment and say that there are two particular standout set pieces of this movie that are great. One is near the middle, and one is near the end. The one near the end is talked about a lot. It involves stairs. It's great, obviously, and I love that I can kind of feel the pain that this man is going through there. And there's a lot of good tension surrounding the need to overcome this staircase and make it to the final boss, so to speak. You really want this guy to make it to the top of these stairs. I kind of found myself clenching my fists in frustration a little bit at this scene, but I think that's a testament to the tension that's built up surrounding this moment. But that scene has been talked about enough already by people smarter than me. The scene that somehow doesn't get talked about nearly as much is a scene in a house. On YouTube, this scene is called Top Down Fight. I love this shit. The unique style which this action set piece is filmed really encapsulates this series as a whole. It's a perfect example of the creativity and amount of care that's put into making a good action movie as opposed to just like a good enough action movie. Everything about that scene fucking rules. The long take, those beautiful incendiary shotgun rounds that just leave the victim as a flaming corpse, the music, the gun fu choreography, and I know the gun fu is spectacular in all of the Wick movies and all throughout this one too, but the unique style of this scene and the wide shots really make that gun fu thing work even better. I could only imagine the amount of work it took to make this. If you haven't seen it, then just know it's like a video game level, but made cinematically and fast-paced, and then brought into live action. Even if you don't care about these movies, just look this one up on YouTube. Top Down Fight. I really like the nods to one of my favorite 70s movies, The Warriors, with the woman on the radio calling the hits for the assassin community. The way the shots are framed during those moments is unmistakably The Warriors, and that was really cool to me. Donnie Yen is in this movie as a character named Kane. He's the retired old blind assassin, fantastic addition, maybe even my favorite of all the non-Keanu characters in this franchise. But a lot of that is because of what Donnie Yen does with this guy. He's blind, so we see how he navigates around that disability as an assassin, and there's just some super neat ideas with this. But it's Donnie Yen that sells this because of his just legendary physical abilities. In another actor's hands, this character might not have come across as well, but Donnie really brings it. And, you know, him playing a blind warrior in another movie a few years ago probably didn't hurt. Now I have to talk about the bulletproof suits. I can see why this is necessary for these stories. Like, how many times is our hero going to be shot at throughout this series of movies, right? 1,000, maybe even more. Bullets are going to have to hit him eventually, and if they didn't, then these movies would basically become a meme and just lose all credibility. So the solution here is bulletproof suits, but it feels like they become a crutch. Earlier, I talked about how the stakes of these series have taken a hit. Well, this is one of the things that, I see it and I'm just like, oh yeah, that. Despite how cool these movies are, as they've gone on, we've seen things like this in the series that I think just undermine the stakes. As for the ending, I would say that I really liked the ending if it wasn't a lie. I can't really blame this movie for that, I guess, but I think as time goes on, people will agree with me that the ending of this is a fucking dick move. I can't say much more outside of that right now, because it's spoilers. So John Wick Chapter 4 does deliver in a big bad way, and yet I think the movie series has lost some steam. And maybe these movies fake you out too much, but show me another action movie where this much care is put into the fight scenes. There's just not that many of them out there. Number 15, Next Goal Wins. After the remarkably bad movie that is Thor: Love and Thunder, Taika Waititi is back with a small comedy about a small soccer team in a small place, American Samoa. This movie is about American Samoa's international soccer team, a really bad soccer team who has never scored a single goal in international competition, based on a true story. This is your classic underdog story, and this movie is funny. Now, comedies really aren't my thing, kind of like horror movies, but this one, let me just say, it puts the big green to shame. There's a new comedic soccer movie in town. I'm sorry, Big Green, you had your run. Taika Waititi can really bring it when he wants to, and what he brings here is this just adorable, feel-good Ted Lasso-style humor. And I don't just say Ted Lasso because it's about soccer. There's like a true wholesomeness to the humor in this movie, just like Ted Lasso. A lot of the characters in American Samoa are just the most likable goofballs you'll see in a movie like this. They're funny, and yet they don't always realize they're being funny, so a lot of the comedy is kind of just the way they speak and the witty dialogue, and sometimes it's mundane, like they're just explaining how things work a lot of time, like the specifics of their island, the American Samoan culture, and it's all just completely charming. There's one actor named Oscar Knightley who plays the second lead character. His name's Tavita, and he is just a delight. Easily the highlight of the movie.
Okay, gentlemen, listen up. In case you don't know me, I'm Tavita Tomua. I'm the president of the Football Federation of American Samoa. But I think you all do know me. Hey, son.
Hey, Dad.
I'm here to beg something from you for the second half. I know we've never ever scored a goal, ever. But we have to, because I've made a bet with the heads of the football federations from the other islands that we could. And if we don't, they're gonna draw a lady boobs on my face. It's some pretty powerful motivation.
But Michael Fassbender is the primary lead in this movie. He plays Thomas Rongen, and he's brought on board to help this struggling team along. He's slightly stereotypical as the very serious outsider. He's hot-headed, and he has no faith in this team. Actually, he's kind of like Danny Glover in Angels in the Outfield. I guess I'm just all 90s sports movies references for this one. Thomas Rongen's arc is a little bit predictable, but even as the serious coach who spends a lot of his time being incredulous or angry, he has some good comedic moments that are peppered in as well. This movie is small and it's very aware of its scale, right? It's a small movie about a small place, and you never get the feeling that it's trying to overextend that. Like, you know the stakes for this team are not world-ending by any means, but you want these people to succeed because they're so damn endearing. It's just a classic underdog tale with a lot of heart. I do recommend this movie if you haven't seen it. If a cynical asshole like me can get into it, then probably anyone can. If I were to pitch this movie in one sentence, I'd say this movie is like Cool Runnings with Taika Waititi's humor. Boom, another 90s movie reference. Number 14, Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. I am a longtime D&D fan. I love the fantasy genre. My favorite book series of all time is called Dragonlance, which is in a kind of adjacent D&D setting. This kind of thing is absolutely my jam, so it's probably no surprise that I really liked Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. Just what a fun fantasy adventure this is. Chris Pine was the absolute right choice as the leading man, Edgin, who in this D&D story plays a bard, which is a charisma-based character, and boy does he have that. He's with a group of adventurers and they have a quest, and man, do they get into some D&D shenanigans. The first thing here that I really loved, just as a fantasy fan, is the party compilation. In addition to our main character, the quick-witted bard, we also have Michelle Rodriguez as the no-nonsense, hard-hitting barbarian. It is really nice to see her do something in a movie other than yell, "Dom! Dom!" There's Simon, played by Justice Smith. He's a wild magic sorcerer. my preferred D&D class. Sophia Lillis of It fame is the Tiefling Druid. She doesn't trust humans and is reluctant to join them, but eventually does, kind of for the greater good. Her character magnificently showcases the druidic wild shape abilities and transforms into an owlbear, and just wreaks absolute havoc on their enemies. When those moments happened, I kind of wanted to cheer. At one point, her shapeshifting also leads to like a really fun and unique chase scene, which I loved. I will say though that her D&D style abilities are more interesting than her personality. And then lastly, Zank Yendar. He's the paladin of the party, and he plays up his role like an annoying party paladin always does, the true noble warrior, the annoyingly honorable do-gooder. But fuck, he is badass when it comes down to combat. The costumes for this, incredible, perfectly in line with this kind of world. The characters wear armor and sets of gear that looks like the kind of thing you'd pick up in a video game of this genre. The use of magic is surprisingly accurate to D&D lore. In fact, there's a lot of care taken with the D&D Forgotten Realms lore, including uses of names that you might know like Neverwinter, the Harpers, Baldur's Gate, the Underdark, Elminster, the Red Wizards of Thay. All classic Forgotten Realms D&D lore. The score perfectly fits this kind of movie. It's actually the kind of thing that plays in my head during a D&D campaign. At least the first few weeks of a D&D campaign before people start canceling and it invariably fizzles out. There are some really great fantasy action scenes in this, primarily in the third act. We see some things that just made the fanboy in me so excited. I felt like a kid during a lot of it. I particularly loved the group team up to take on the big bad at the end. There's like a good 15-second sequence within that fight that's very Avengers, but extremely satisfying with each member of the team using their skills together in combat. It's a beautiful wide shot, and it just delivered the exact kind of thing I signed up for with this movie. But the movie comes down to a heist, which actually got me thinking, why hasn't this been done more? Why haven't there been more D&D movies like this? Because a heist is really the perfect setting. It's a classic D&D quest. Now, you should know that this movie is not like Lord of the Rings, and I love Lord of the Rings, but this is a different beast entirely. It just doesn't have that Lord of the Rings kind of scale or pace. It doesn't have the methodical nature that Lord of the Rings has. It's a fast-moving, fun D&D adventure. This movie is really just like a romp. So if Lord of the Rings is like Star Trek, this movie is like Star Wars. If you haven't seen this, please don't automatically write it off and lump it into that god-awful year 2000 Dungeons & Dragons movie or any of its sequels. The writers/directors of this, it's John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein. They absolutely put care into this and were not just trying to sell a product on the basis of name recognition. You can tell that the two of these guys are in this D&D fan base, and they put on screen what they would have wanted to see as moviegoers. You can tell that by watching it. Now, John Francis Daley is a name that you might not know, but I know his name well because he was in one season of the 2000s show that I loved called Freaks and Geeks. He played one of the main characters, Sam Weir, who in the last episode of the show plays a D&D campaign with his friends. It actually ties up season 1 really wonderfully, seeing this group of people bond this way. Knowing that show and then seeing that John Francis Daley co-directed this movie was very heartwarming to me. By the way, that show is definitely worth a watch. Created by Paul Feig, starring Linda Cardellini, James Franco, Seth Rogen, and Jason Segel. A lot of those episodes were written by Judd Apatow. It's basically like the precursor to the Judd Apatow comedy movement of the late 2000s. For my money, I'd say it started all there with Freaks and Geeks. So anyway, I don't know if you have to be into D&D or fantasy to enjoy this movie. All I know is that I am, and I did. Number 13, Saw X. If I had a nickel for every franchise sequel I saw last year that ended in X, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. That's a stupid joke. That's an old joke. I apologize. All right, this is another one that we did a full podcast on at Spoilers, episode 477. I actually tried to get those guys to do a Saw Patrol podcast where we review Saw X and the new Paw Patrol movie in one episode, but they declined because they hate cinema. So we just did Saw X. All right. I saw one of the Saw movies last year, which is something I don't normally do. And one reason for that is because then I have to say, I saw Saw, and I just fucking hate that wording. I seen Saw X. Whatever. Saw X, I really did like this movie. Now, I have seen the first one, and I have seen the second one, although I was not in a rational state of mind at the time. And I have seen some of 3, so I'm no Saw expert, but after seeing the second one and then hearing the reviews of the many, many sequels as the years went on, for me, the writing was kind of on the wall about what this franchise became. It became something different than the first movie, and that's fine, I guess. There's clearly a desire to see this gory, bloody, torture porn genre of movies. Saw X does have those things, but this is, very surprisingly to me, a character-driven story. Saw X takes place after the first movie, so it's a prequel. And in this prequel, we explore how John Kramer, Jigsaw, is handling his cancer diagnosis. We spend a lot of time with this man, and we feel bad for him. He's actually the hero of this story, or at least the protagonist anti-hero. So John Kramer does pull out the traps once again in this movie, but this time, he's doing it against evil. People that might even be bigger pieces of shit than he is, at least in some cases. Well, certainly in some cases, I'd say. The thing that I really like about this movie is how much time we spend on the human story. Horror movies don't always have the best character development. Saw movies don't always have the best character development. This one really excels on that front, and we feel this level of sympathy for a horror villain that really took me by surprise. Tobin Bell did a great job, and he deserves all the praise in the world for what he delivered with this one. So this movie is not all just like traps and pranks. It gets into the slow burn territory of a drama, but eventually, the script is kind of flipped. He breaks out the traps, and when he does, they kind of have some meaning to their use. But they're also horrific in the kind of now standard Saw manner. The evolution of the traps in the Saw movies is fucking bonkers. Think of the first movie. There's 2 guys in a room, and they're chained to a wall. They each have a saw. In order to escape, they have to saw off one of their own limbs. Very different than what this franchise is now. Another trap from the first movie, actually, is the head explodey device. Amanda has this thing on her head, and in order to take it off within the allotted time before it explodes, she needs a key. But the key is inside of another man who is dead and nearby. So in the first movie, to get out of this trap, she has to cut it out of a dead man's stomach. That certainly is like a gross prospect, but I don't think that's an insurmountable endeavor. The traps that are on display in this movie sometimes are insurmountable. I won't get into the details, but there is no coming back from the damage that's done to get released from some of these traps. But that speaks to what I mentioned earlier about this series being different now than what it began as. Once the precedent of the extravagant mousetrap self-mutilation situation was set in place in the Saw sequels, there was really no going back to that simplistic format of the first movie. I mentioned Amanda a second ago. She's in this movie, and she has one of the worst haircuts I've ever seen in my life. She looks like a medieval page boy, and it was completely distracting. But for the story, she's a great addition. We get a sense of where these two are at this point in the greater Saw storyline, and it kind of answers some questions that I didn't even realize I had. My final note on this movie is that a lot of it takes place in Mexico, and it's one of the most obscene uses of the Mexico filter in a movie that you will ever see. When they arrive in Mexico, the movie suddenly becomes a fucking Simpsons character with jaundice. It is yellow. So if you're squeamish, you're definitely going to have to look away sometimes. But I think you should still watch this movie because the story is enough for even you to probably like it. I hope. Don't at me if that's not the case, but try it out. Watch it with the kids. Number 12, The Iron Claw. The tragic true story of the famous Von Erich family in the wrestling industry, brought to us by A24. But this is not a movie about wrestling. The focus here is this family, and this movie is better for it. It's not as much about wrestling, this movie, as it is about legacy, family, and really family expectations. And of course, big-time tragedy in the form of what's referred to as the Von Erich curse. I think a lot of wrestling fans know this story already, but if you don't, then I won't give anything away other than what's in the trailer, and I'll just say to you, prepare for some heartbreak. This family story is engaging enough as it is, and it's something I knew a little bit about from an episode of a wrestling documentary called The Dark Side of the Ring, but the performances here are one of the key things that make this movie great. The family dynamic has this truly authentic feel, and you just end up feeling so bad for what these people end up going through, and you really want them to succeed and for everything to kind of just be all right in the end. My personal favorite of the performances is probably Holt McCallany as Fritz Von Erich, a secondary character. He plays the father, the patriarch of the Von Erich clan. This guy is low-key amazing. You may not know the name, but you probably know him as Bill from Mindhunter, or the guy who says his name is Robert Paulson from Fight Club. And then you have Zac Efron as Kevin Von Erich and Jeremy Allen White as Kerry Von Erich. Both are fantastic, and they have such pain behind their eyes at times. They also had some insane physical transformations to embody the wrestlers that they're playing. Now you can probably nitpick in the area of their physiques because Efron's physique isn't exactly like Kevin, and the same goes for Jeremy Allen White, but the point is they're built like wrestlers for this movie. And this is just a side note, but Jeremy Allen White continues to impress me with his performances. I'm really glad to see him grow beyond the role of Lip from Shameless. Even though I really do like that show, he's doing great things with this and The Bear, and I really look forward to seeing his continued work. The best wrestling movies that I can think of are this one and Darren Aronofsky's The Wrestler, both of which just showcase how shitty the wrestling industry is, or at least how shitty it can be, and then kind of the mental and physical toll it exacts on those within it. That is very much on display here, but the tragedy in stories like this can make for a great movie, and this one certainly is great. That being said, this is based on a real story, so they do take us into the ring a few times. Now, the wrestling is alright. I think it's done well enough, especially considering that this is a movie. Apparently, Chavo Guerrero assisted in the wrestling choreography, which is really cool. Wrestling fans will know that name. But we get the appearance of a famous wrestler in this movie that many people will know, Ric Flair. But of course, this is meant to be in the early 80s, so it's an actor playing Ric Flair. The actual Flair is not present in this movie. And I gotta say, the Ric Flair performance is not good. They have this guy cut a promo in the movie, and he just does not capture the magnetism of the Nature Boy. And it sounds like he kind of has an accent that slips through once or twice. I don't like it. Here's a clip from the movie of the actor Aaron Dean Eisenberg playing Ric Flair compared to the actual Ric Flair.
I am the world's heavyweight champion because I am the greatest wrestler alive today, the toughest wrestler alive today. I have bled and sweat for this title, and no daddy's boy is going to take that from me. This is professional wrestling. It is the most grueling of all professional sports. I've been stabbed, hit by chairs, beat up by everybody. I don't cry, I don't complain, I carry on. But the bottom line is,
you're denying.
I am talking right now. Hey, listen to me. Listen to me. I'll tell you what. You like talking to me on the show. You will listen to me talk while I'm out here. Everybody needs to have something to live for each day. But you, in reality, are never, ever gonna be able to say you were the world champion. You're never gonna be able to put this in your old pickup truck next to your blue jeans and your cowboy boots and your cut-off t-shirt and try to tell anybody, much less yourself, that you're the world champion.
So one thing that I guess wrestling historians might find odd here is that one of the Von Erichs is actually missing from the movie, Chris. He was another one of the many brothers in this family. He actually wasn't forgotten about. It was intentionally done this way so that the script would come together the way that the writer-director Sean Durkin wanted. But I'll just say that if Chris was in this movie would have been even more tragic. Somehow. Overall, this one is a definite recommend from me. It's semi-slow moving, so maybe not the most exciting, but it's deliberate in the time it takes for you to feel for these characters, the story, and just this family and their plight. Check this one out. Number 11, The Flash. Yeah, I like this movie. Fuck you, okay? You know what? Actually, first I need to shout out my British brother Ellis at the YouTube channel Total Movie Recall. He and I did a 2-hour live stream reviewing and discussing this movie, so you can definitely get more there. To find his channel, search Total Movie Recall Podcast on YouTube. The channel is kind of hard to find. If you just search Total Movie Recall, you'll get a bunch of clips from the Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, Total Recall, which is a cool movie, but that's not what we're doing here. So once you find his channel, go to the live tab and it's episode number 4. Search Total Movie Recall Podcast. So with The Flash, I was pumped for this movie. This may have been one of my highest anticipated movies of the year. And I cared about this movie for one solitary reason: Michael Keaton as Batman. Now, did they deliver? Yes. More on that soon. So in this movie, Barry Allen, also known as the Flash, he uses the Speed Force to go back in time to save his family, but things don't go exactly as planned. This movie is directed by Andy Muschietti, the director of the modern It movies, and it was written by Christina Hodson, who wrote another DC movie I really like, Birds of Prey. And additionally, there's 2 names that I discussed a little bit earlier, John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein. They were also writers on this. Those were the 2 key names attached to the Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves movie I talked about earlier. First, I have to talk about something that's been discussed a lot surrounding this movie, which is the special effects. The effects really can be atrocious. I feel like the $200 million budget should have taken them a little bit further in the area of visuals. Now, not everything looks awful, but many things do. There's a scene involving babies, which is so bad it basically became a meme. The special effects problem is primarily on display when Barry uses his Speed Force ability, and the characters become like a freeze-frame CGI construct. It's not good. Characters that are supposed to look human look more like video games come to life in those moments. The director, Andy Muschietti, later said that this is intentional, like the special effects are supposed to look this bad, which really does seem like bullshit. But the story of this movie is multiversal, which may be a turnoff to some, but I do like some of the things they did with it. Some small things I like are when we get the 2 Barrys, they come together, and this kind of helps fix some of the character issues we've had with Barry in the previous DC movies. Like in the previous movies, he's kind of been an annoying little bastard in the Snyderverse, but in this movie, he's basically forced to mature by dealing with a younger, more annoying version of himself. And that being said, we still have to deal with the annoying one too. But the 2 of them exist in this parallel world, and there's some little things in this parallel world that I really like, which are kind of just nods for geeks like me. For example, in this new world that Barry travels to, it comes up in a conversation that it was Eric Stoltz who played Marty McFly in Back to the Future. That's just kind of a great geek joke. It reminds me of the movie Last Action Hero, where in their universe, Sylvester Stallone played the Terminator. But more important to the grand scheme of this story is that this parallel world does not have a Justice League. There's no Superman, no Aquaman, no Diana, but there's a threat coming. Now, there is one publicly known hero in this universe, and that's Batman. And it's not just any Batman, but the goddamn best Batman, Michael Keaton Batman. Tim Burton's version of Batman. Oh, those lucky fucks. This is easily my favorite aspect of the movie and why it's rated so high on my list. Michael Keaton as Batman fucking delivers, baby. The two Barrys seek out this guy for help, and everything about this works for me, including the introduction of Wayne Manor in terms of the aesthetic. There's a room inside the Wayne Manor mansion with armored suits, which is a great nod. The mini action scene inside the manor, and the movie gets even better from there when the three of them head together for like a superhero mission in Russia. In Russia, there's just some fucking delectable fan service that delivers in the exact ways I was hoping it would. Batman is so epic in combat in this movie, in a way that he just wasn't physically able to achieve in the Tim Burton Batman movies because of the stiffness of the suit he had. You know, he's an older man now, and that plays into it, but he still got it. And we get some of the best uses of a Batarang I've seen in any live-action depiction of this character. These scenes are just some of my favorite superhero taking out bad guy scenes of the year, maybe of the last few years. Now, I'm not saying this is like number one for me. I'm not saying it has like the same creativity as the big action scene in the Marvels or another movie that I'll be talking about soon. But because of my attachment to this version of the character, it gave me goosebumps and it just made me feel like a kid again. And they also keep this version of Batman true to form with keeping his tech kind of outdated because he's been retired for a while. Like, he breaks out a tape measure at one point, and he has like an analog phone that hooks up to some old shitty device. And then that Elfman score comes in during those moments, the classic Batman theme. Man, it just works for me. Also, around this time of the movie, we meet Kara Zor-El, aka Supergirl. She gets a great action scene as well and just devastates some Russian goons in the way that only a Kryptonian superhero can. There's also a story choice later with Supergirl that I really like, but I'm gonna have to save that one for the spoiler section of the episode. Other than those like really key moments, the overall story for this is pretty basic. There's like a semi-Justice League scene at the beginning of the movie that has some decent moments, but really feels neutered. The revelation of who the villain is behind the scenes isn't great, but there's a lot of things in that area that I'm going to have to save for the spoiler section. I was just very much along for the ride with this movie, despite its flaws that came up here and there, effects, story problems. For me, the highlights of this movie definitely outshine the flaws. Like, the highs were much higher than the lows were low. So I really do like a lot of what's happening in this movie, but I also realize that this one comes down to the individual. I'll say that this movie doesn't have much rewatchability outside of a few certain chunks of the movie. There is a very emotionally moving moment near the end, like it tugs at the heartstrings in a pretty effective way, but once we're beyond that, and we get to the very last scene of the movie, when it ends, that is outrageously bad. Like, I can only assume that that last moment of the movie is still there because the director, like, lost the bet or something. So, anyway, at the end of the day, it comes down to this. If you love Michael Keaton as Batman, then watch this movie. Number 10, Barbie. You know, no one goes to the movies anymore. Unless the internet collectively decides that everyone is going to. Before there was even a full trailer for this movie, somehow the internet just latched onto this bad boy. And I'm talking even before Barbenheimer was a thing. I think as soon as Margot Robbie was being talked about, that was a wrap. People wanted this movie. And I do think this movie is quality, but all that aside, this movie was just a win out of the gate somehow. Now, the fact that this movie was actually good has made it currently the highest grossing Warner Brothers movie of all time. Yes, somehow this movie made more money than Aquaman 2. Now, this is another one where we did a full podcast on this movie over at Spoilers, which is episode 467. We talk much more in depth over there than I'm going to here, so check out that episode later, and don't hold Pappy's audio issues against him. To describe the plot of this movie, I'll just say there's a world of Barbies and Kens, and one particular Barbie and one particular Ken come into the real world. Our world, mostly. First thing here is the look and the feel of the Barbie world. It is incredible. It's stunning and vibrant. It has the necessary artificial toy-like feeling to the buildings as well as the nature. Like the trees are like cardboard cutouts, and the campfires are like a little plastic toy version of a campfire that would come with like Camping Trip Barbie. I love just about everything in terms of how the Barbie world looks and the little rules that kind of come along with that. The scale of the buildings or like the vehicles compared to the people is perfectly in line with the Barbie product. Barbie is almost as big as her own car, for example. And these visual aspects of the movie might just be my favorite thing about it. They're really just wonderful. There's also some kind of cute bits of comedy within the Barbie world, namely with the deprecated Barbie products, which are out of place in their own home world, as they were in ours, I suppose. Margot Robbie is a great Barbie. She fits the look perfectly, and I do think she's a great actress, but it's really Ryan Gosling as Ken that's the highlight of this movie. A lot of the comedy falls on him and the other Kens who, just following the logic of the Barbie product, play second fiddle to Barbie. The roles of men and women as portrayed in this movie are from the perspective of the Mattel Barbie product, right? Barbie rules, Ken doesn't. This Ken and all the Kens are basically second-class citizens in the Barbie world, just as Ken toys are kind of like second-class toys, or like an afterthought. If you don't believe me, take a Barbie doll and take a Ken doll, try to pull the Barbie's head off, and then try to pull the Ken's head off. The Ken head comes right off, or at least it used to last time I checked. It was a long time ago. But I remember there being like a little bit of a cheapness to the manufacturing of Ken. Maybe Mattel cares a little bit less about that product than they do about Barbie, and that kind of plays into this movie. I personally thought the transformation of the main Ken and the other Kens was where the movie really excelled, comedically speaking. I do have a few bullet points of some of the things I loved about that area, like the Kens explaining the Godfather to the women, something I know nothing about. Push by Matchbox 20 being like the Ken anthem, I thought that was really funny. The Kens settling their differences between each other through interpretive dance, which is really great. And another thing I love is Ken's redundant vocabulary. It's just a great way to showcase like what an airhead he is. It's also kind of funny how the Barbie women exploit the fragile male ego of the Kens when the story is at a point where there's like conflict between those two parties. And I know when this movie came out, some of the grifters online talked about how this movie is anti-men. And if that's your takeaway after watching the whole movie, then my response is, I don't know, don't be such a pussy. Having that position, in a way, ultimately kind of proves the movie right, actually. But this movie does start to slip a little bit downward as we reach the end of the movie with the Barbies kind of regaining their agency in Barbie Land. There's something that happens in the movie to accomplish this, and it's just so on the nose and lacks any kind of subtlety. I'm sure a few people rolled their eyes at that moment, but in the grand scheme of the movie, I think it's forgivable because of the incredible comedy by Ryan Gosling, the look of Barbie Land, and the I'm Just Ken song, which is also right in this area of the movie. Now, the success of this movie may actually be a curse on mankind for years to come, because Mattel is now going to make a bunch of movies based on their products. Yay! What movies, you're probably asking? Well, Hot Wheels, Polly Pocket, Magic 8 Ball, and Uno are some of the names that are currently slated. It's just insane to me to think that the lesson learned from this is that general audiences want to see more Mattel product movies. This is why we can't have nice things. So I do like where this movie leaves off at the end, you know, with Ken having to find his identity and having to find out like what existence means outside of this woman. Barbie's arc is more about what it means to be a woman, and that leads to the final joke of the movie. Overall, this movie is very good. Aside from some very heavy-handed progressive messaging, it's very funny and very well crafted. Good movie. Number 9, Oppenheimer. The Enheimer of the Barbenheimer craze is my number 9. I'm pretty sure every major actor in Hollywood was contractually obligated to appear in either this movie or in Asteroid City last year. God damn, do we have some names in this movie. But before I go into those names, I just want to say that I saw this movie with Alan and Steve at the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. We saw it on film in IMAX, and like many other theaters, ours broke down about 80% of the way into the movie, and they had to switch it from film to digital. I guess not many theaters are equipped to handle like 10 miles or whatever it is of IMAX film. I don't know the details, but man, I swear I have bad luck with Alan and Steve. Anyway, as we were waiting to get inside, I told Alan that I think this movie is going to be 3 acts consisting of the following. Act 1. Cillian Murphy smoking a cigarette, stressed out that he has to build a bomb. Act 2. Cillian Murphy smoking a cigarette, stressed out about building a bomb. And Act 3, Cillian Murphy smoking a cigarette, stressed out that he built a bomb. What I didn't foresee is all of that plus a courtroom drama that I did not expect to be as invested in as I was, especially considering when you look at the court case, which is like the B-plot of the movie. The stakes are pretty low in the grand scheme of the world, at least compared to the stakes of the world's first fucking nuke. It's a court case about a man's government security clearance, and I guess secondarily his reputation. But man, the stress of this whole situation. I'm led to believe that J. Robert Oppenheimer has never had a solitary moment of peace in his entire existence. This movie does a great job at maintaining consistent tension throughout the runtime. You really feel the pressure of each of the storylines as we go through them, and Nolan does a great job at like taking Oppenheimer's burdens and just kind of giving them back to the audience and saying, okay, you deal with this. And of course we have the classic Nolan maneuver of like bouncing between different periods of time, as only the master himself can do. But also, this is what someone might call like a talking movie. It's a movie mostly about people having conversations in a room, or I guess outside. But the point is that this isn't Fast X or a sports movie or a flashy, colorful movie like Barbie or a sci-fi dystopia or a war epic or any of that shit. I think a movie like this has a much harder job of keeping the viewer's interest. You have to get the audience invested in the people, in the stakes, and in this case, the project. The project here, of course, being the Manhattan Project, which is fascinating to see the kind of behind the scenes of. It's both something you feel like you want to see succeed, but also not succeed in some ways. But because this is a historical drama, it does of course go the way it went in reality, and the project is completed, and the culmination of all the events to this point is represented by a nuclear bomb test, which was quite a sight to see on the big screen. It was a very big moment for the movie, and it was a spectacle to behold. There's kind of a real like hold your breath tension as it goes off with no sound, and then a very startling moment as the shockwave sound hits you, and then a very nice but albeit brief sense of relief, which a lot of credit goes to the musical score in terms of conveying that momentary reprieve that you finally get from all this tension. I loved both the stories in this movie and the many side characters and the incredible actors that play them. The major standout, of course, is Robert Downey Jr. as Louis Strauss. A lot of people have talked about him and how he kind of steals the show in this movie, but rightfully so. It's easy to forget that this man's acting chops go way beyond Iron Man and Weird Science. There's Jason Clarke. You know, I've shit on him before when we did episode 100 of this podcast. He totally redeems himself in my eyes as Roger Robb. He kind of brings this unhinged intensity, which brought forth many memes. We thank you for that. He's still the worst John Connor I've ever seen, though. There's too many great actors and performances to shout out individually, so I'll just say this is an absolutely stacked cast. It could be one of the best of all time. with performances that will likely be talked about for years to come. This is absolutely a great movie if you can get into a movie that's structured this way. But now, to speak on this movie a little bit further, a man who I respect immensely, Ronnie Oppenheimer of the Wasted Potential podcast.
Hi, I'm Ronnie from Wasted Potential podcast, and normally I'm joined by my co-host Shane or Hobo Dan, but Korey told me he wanted a good podcast, so I'm here alone. I've been tasked to do a brief review of the behemoth of a film. That's right, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. It's the tale of Cillian Murphy and Robert Downey Jr. having history's most pathetic but fascinating pissing contest, all the while wrestling with ethical dilemma of creating an atomic bomb that can vaporize its victims and makes discussions of pre, during, and post-World War II relations with Japan super awkward for Americans, all the while showcasing a flawed genius asshole whose scientific breakthrough inadvertently will lead us all to a fiery World War III. Jokes aside, Christopher Nolan has made his masterpiece, juxtaposing colored 70mm film portraying J. Robert Oppenheimer's point of view, called Fusion, and black and white film portraying Senator Strauss's perspective, called Fission. Two intertwining stories dance between Robert's early years as a dirty commie teacher to researching, experimenting, and campaigning for and then against the atomic bomb and nuclear proliferation, his security clearance gray board ethics hearing attempting to smear his character, and Senator Strauss's presidential cabinet hearing. Oppenheimer is tortured by images and sounds of quantum reactions, solar flares, and Ludwig Göransson's anxiety-inducing music to get us into Oppenheimer's head and empathize with our consciously guilt-ridden hero, or to create a panic attack in the audience. Nolan creates the best cinematic moment of the year, mixing a roaring crowd and speech, intercut with images of the camera pulsating, silent warbling, vaporizing flashes, and charred bodies, revealing Oppie's guilt-ridden realization of what he has created. Cillian Murphy is at his career best as the titular Oppenheimer, and Robert Downey Jr. is pitch perfect as a political prick foil to the protagonist. Numerous cameos and Hollywood elite show up to earn a SAG Award nomination for Best Cast, or whatever that award is actually called. And it also features possibly the greatest MacGuffin/character mystery since Rosebud. Spoilers, it's middle school gossip between people who are powerful enough to bruise the egos of men who can literally destroy all of humanity. All Oscars should go to the cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema and the sound design and editing teams, but also give Emily Blunt her golden statue too. Her role as Oppenheimer's wife perfectly encapsulates the theme of the film, which is that women are just objects to conquest and help inspire the hubris of man, children, to lead us all to our own doom. All the while, they need to be there to pick us up and kiss our boo-boos while we fantasize about some side chicks. I'll wrap up this phenomenal film that makes a bunch of men talking about science, philosophy, ethics, and legacy for over 3 hours. Very interesting, with a quote from my co-host Shane. Florence Pugh's boobs get a 4 to 5 stars. Thank you, and experience Oppenheimer.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Number 8, Creed 3. First off, I want to say I did a podcast on all of the Rocky movies on a neighbor podcast, Wasted Potential, which is led by the man you just heard from, Ronnie. You're probably asking yourself how you can find their show. Well, I rarely seem to collaborate with a podcast that's easy to find. I searched Wasted Potential on Apple Podcasts, and I think I found 8 results. The one I collaborated with, the one you're looking for, is the one with the black and white logo with the words Wasted Potential in red text. And the Rocky episode is episode 1 of season 4 of their show, released just about a year ago. So I'm a huge fan of the Rocky franchise, and I have enjoyed the Creed films too. I'm actually amazed that we've gotten so many quality movies from this series, and they continue to be good to this day. The original Rocky movie came out almost 50 years ago. Just look at like the Jurassic Park franchise, which hasn't been around for nearly as long, sure, but they pump out just absolute garbage at this point. And yet with the Rocky franchise, there's filmmakers who seem like they actually give a shit about the product. This is the first movie in the series without Stallone, but that's okay because at this point in the Creed series, it doesn't really feel like we need him. In Creed 2, Rocky's story was tied up perfectly, and it actually tied back to a previous movie which made me smile in the biggest way, because it was my favorite Rocky movie that it connected back to. And that's where kind of Rocky left the franchise. But in this entry, Adonis Creed reconnects with his childhood friend Damien, and their past kind of catches up with them. And then eventually the two of them must resolve their issues by punching each other in the face. Damien is played by Jonathan Majors, and he is incredible in this movie. Absolutely incredible. This man is just a presence on screen. And when you first meet him, he plays his character so differently than he is by the time he becomes the official villain. When we first meet Damien, you can really see the child within him, and I think the subtlety of his performance and that specific characterization is hugely impactful. The story does jump back to when they're kids a few times, and it covers some significant events which affect the current storyline. And at certain points in the movie, when you come back to Jonathan Majors as the adult version of Damien, it's like you can see that scared little boy in his eyes. And then, we start to see his ego grow and he makes his way in the boxing world. And we see how insanely jacked he is. They actually made how buff he is a reveal within the movie. Because a lot of the movie he's kind of hidden underneath heavy sweatshirts until the moment he steps into the ring for the first time. And then you realize oh shit, this is not a scared little boy. This is a fucking behemoth of a man. There are some very interesting things introduced in the boxing matches that we haven't seen before, namely with the boxing style from Damien. The camera focuses in on some aspects of the fights that would probably be unnoticed if you were watching an actual boxing match, in real time. There's some cheap shots and some fuckery that Damien gets up to in the ring in order to win. I think it's really neat how the camera hones in on those. The final fight of the movie. The final fight is very important in every movie of this franchise. The movie has to build up to it and then deliver. This one does a great job at getting you invested in the personal nature of the story building up, and then it also delivers on the fight itself. You really feel the weight of this fight because of how hugely personal it is to both parties involved. And then they do something in the fight that might be controversial. I think some people didn't love it, but they take a whole new approach to the final boxing match a few minutes in. I won't say too much else about that for now, and I'll kind of leave it in the spoiler section, but I will say that it did work for me. And I'll also say that the choreography and the amount of time that they spend on boxing matches in the Creed movies really shows. They never let you down, and they always continue to impress with the planning and execution of those final boxing matches. I think you can really tell that Michael B. Jordan is just dedicated to making these fights great. This one definitely lives up to the high standard of boxing set in the Creed movies, and I guess the Rocky movies too, for that matter. Creed 3, it's just another great entry into what might be one of the best movie franchises out there. But I don't have to tell you twice, if you're a Rocky fan, chances are you've seen it already. Number 7, Talk to Me. I have said for a long time that I'm not a big horror guy, and I think that's still true, but I had a mini revelation after watching this movie. I now know what kind of horror movies I like, and that is the curse movie. The curse horror movie is where there's some kind of paranormal curse involved. The ones that come to mind are Smile and It Follows, both of which I really enjoy. And some might argue this one, Talk to Me, isn't completely that, but it really does give that same vibe. There's a somber aura of hopelessness in this movie, and movies like this, and I do kind of find myself attracted to that dreariness in a horror movie. There's a sense of grief that's established early on in the movie, and then the movie really clings to that feeling all throughout the runtime. Now the trailer really tells this story, but some teens get their hands on, a cursed item. We know very little about this item's history, and I think that plays to the movie's benefit. I don't think we need like the overindulgence of the expert who knows every detail about where something came from. With this movie, there's just enough of that for us to kind of let it be. So with this cursed item and through a series of many poor decisions, things get really bad for these teenagers. There's something realistic about the depiction of the teenagers in this movie that worked for me. It's how, like, when they engage in this ritual, they immediately all take out their phones and start recording it for social media. The willingness of these kids to participate in something so awful is done for, like, peer acceptance and social media likes, and I do think that's exactly how it would go, actually. The premise for this movie I just find to be really strong. It's simple, but strong. And this premise really opens the door to get some truly haunting horror visuals, and they're not overused, but are just disgusting and disturbing when you do see them. There's some depictions of something like hell in this movie that really messed me up. It is some truly dark, horrible shit. There's also a real sense of physical pain in this movie when someone gets hurt. Like, you really feel the blows and the damage they do. There's just like some bone-crunching trauma that's really excellently displayed. Probably a credit to the sound design and the makeup effects. Like I said earlier, there's just a drab tone that's set here, and it's something I find really attractive. I think a horror movie for me is either going to turn me off very early with like its cheap corniness, which I think is what a lot of horror movies do, or in the case of a movie like this, draw me in with its authenticity and its kind of grim approach. This movie is just a really good, cool, small Australian horror movie that didn't rely on a bunch of the horror tropes that make up a lot of the horror movies that I hate. And I do hate a lot of horror movies. It's really my default position on them. So if something breaks through that, then I really find it special. The movie also really nicely falls back on itself at the end, too. It's grim, but it's really well written. With this movie, I think if you can set aside some really poor decisions made by children, I think you'll find this to be an upper echelon horror movie that is pretty effectively scary and very effectively hopeless. You may leave this movie a bit more depressed than you were when you started watching it, but that means the movie did its job. Number 6, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Kids these days are so lucky to have this, but also, we all are. Miles Morales and his spider friends are back for another multiversal adventure, and it is wonderful. The important thing to me about this movie is the animation. On the merits of just pure artistic value, this is the best animated movie ever made, because it is groundbreaking. I'm not saying it's my personal favorite, but I don't think there's any denying that this is a marvel, and I'm about to gush all over this, so strap in. There's so many different styles of animation present here, and there's choices that I don't think I've ever seen until this movie, or rather this series of movies, because this is a sequel after all. There's just so much care put into the visuals, to the point where sounds are animated, where you'll see emotions that are included in the animation in terms of color. Sometimes in a scene, the background will kind of lose shape and become a blur of watercolors just to enhance the moment. And sometimes the music and the tone and the colors will establish a mood that I can only compare to one of my favorite movies of all time, Good Time. And to give the viewer such a different kind of feeling during a Spider-Man movie, to give energy that's not typical to Spider-Man movies we've seen, while still keeping everything that makes it a Spider-Man movie, is just captivating. And this is a true superhero comic book movie, in story but also visually. There are some great moments in this movie where a character in motion gets like a 1-second freeze frame, and the shot will just briefly transform into like what would be the cover if this were a comic book. Like a spider character is swinging through the frame, and the movie just takes a snapshot, gives that snapshot some pizzazz, and then continues on. I'm sure you've seen comic books before, where oftentimes the cover is a little bit sleeker, a little bit sexier. It's almost like a tribute to that exact concept sometimes. The voice acting is fantastic. Some of my favorites are Oscar Isaac as Spider-Man 2099, Jason Schwartzman as the Spot, and Daniel Kaluuya as Spider-Punk. Spider-Punk is also an incredible addition to this movie. That's a character I've never heard of before, but great addition, not just to the story, but to the artistic value of the movie. This character design is like nothing I've ever seen, and it definitely stands out among the rest. It's like he appears to be drawn from like old comic strip or newspaper clippings. In fact, he looks like he's kind of fragmented bits of those things all glued together. And sometimes he'll look a little bit more 2D than his companions. And they also adjust his frame rate so that his motion fits his aesthetic. There's also the Spot, who I mentioned a moment ago. He's a great villain in this story. He kind of evolves with the movie as the scale of the story increases. And at times, he's actually a pretty good comedic addition. Speaking of the comedy, it really does come together well. I have kind of a soft spot for superhero movie comedy, but even beyond that, I think it just stands well on its own. Now, I will say this movie is extremely long for the type of movie that it is, but since I loved it, the runtime didn't really bother me. I will say that the first hour does move pretty slowly, maybe too slow for some, but it spends its downtime on character, which I am absolutely okay with. And the movie does make some pretty big tonal shifts as it goes on and kind of furthers the story. Like, it doesn't feel one certain way the whole time. So it can be pretty light and fun, and it can be pretty heavy, but I found that it transitions the tonal atmosphere of everything really well. So you're never really left with the question of, what am I meant to be feeling with all of this? I'll say a few more things in the spoiler section, but for now I'll just say, if you haven't watched the 2 animated Spider-Man movies for some reason, maybe like you feel nothing's original anymore, or you think, the Spider-Man movies are just kind of carbon copies of each other, or maybe you're like me, and you're just not that into animated movies. Suck it up and give these ones a shot because they are so worth it. Number 5, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem. I have been a fan of the Turtles franchise for as long as I can remember. This is like Goodfellas. For as long as I could remember, I always wanted to be a Ninja Turtle. I've seen many adaptations of the Ninja Turtles over the years, my favorite being the first feature, the 1990 movie. I love that movie to death. I talk about it all the time. That movie will probably get its own podcast someday. It's one of my favorite movies of the 90s. Other adaptations of the Turtles, I haven't liked as much, but I don't follow everything Turtles the way a franchise superfan might. But I am an old school fan. This cartoon is part of my childhood, and the first 2 movies also part of my childhood, and my adulthood for that matter. Seeing this movie was special to me because I went with my daughter and we both loved it. What was even better though was that this opened the door for me to be able to show her the original 1990 movie, which she was then open to, and she liked that one too, which really made me happy. But on to this movie, Mutant Mayhem, fucking fantastic. And the first thing you'll notice about this movie is the incredibly unique art style. It's a CGI animated movie, but it's not your standard Pixar, Illumination, or whatever style of animation. This movie is fucking art. It looks like a mixture of CG, stop motion, there's some 2D or maybe hand-drawn in there. It just has this beautiful, artistic comic book flair. It's such its own style and it works so well. And I know I just got done talking about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, which is also amazing in terms of animation. But I feel like what Into the Spider-Verse did, the 2018 movie, it kind of paved the way for a movie like this to exist with its own unique art style. I love what's being done here in the industry, and I really hope we get to see more movies take chances like these ones visually. The Turtles in this movie are pretty young. I guess they're actual teenagers. They're extremely endearing, and they have that necessary camaraderie that you need within the TMNT dynamic. It's also modern, so they're slightly more Gen Z than like 90s surfer kids, but they never completely separate from that original TMNT vibe. This is still the Turtles, but like many adaptations before it, this is a new version of them. This version has cell phones, which they use but don't overly rely on, and they have their own modern pop culture references sprinkled in, like they talk about BTS rather than, say, Vanilla Ice. Splinter's also in this movie, of course, voiced by Jackie Chan. When I first heard about this casting choice, I thought it was one of those voice castings for name recognition only, which kind of turned me off to the thought of this choice, despite my longtime appreciation of Jackie Chan. But I didn't find that actually to be the case here. Jackie Chan is certainly a different version of Splinter, but he's a version I liked a lot. His voice acting is actually a great fit for this version. He's kind of like a true father figure here, and a lot of the emotional core of this movie comes from him, and it works great. And he's also very funny. There's a lot of funny characters here as well, many of which old school fans like myself will recognize. Leatherhead, Wingnut, fucking Mondo Gecko. I had that toy. But what this movie does is it gives us a new story. It doesn't rehash some of the old Turtle stories we've seen before, which would have been the easy choice to do. And this movie is frankly just charming as shit. This movie definitely took me by surprise. You should watch it. It's funny, it's sweet, and if you're an old school fan like me, you'll find a lot of small Easter eggs that just give you a smile when you watch it. Cowabunga it is. Number 4, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. I do realize with this last string of movies I've talked about, the fanboy in me is definitely showing. But hear me out. This movie proves that not only can a great superhero movie make money, but it can also be immune from the all superhero movies are bad narrative, which is oh so popular right now. This movie made $845 million, and it deserved every penny. At the time of this recording, this movie is number 93 on Box Office Mojo's list of highest grossing movies of all time. And it's cool that this movie broke into the top 100, but what I find most interesting is Zoe Saldana. She plays Gamora in the Guardian series, and she's in the top 3 highest grossing movies just by herself. She's in Avatar, Avengers Endgame, and Avatar 2. And then a few notches down the list, but still in the top 10, she's in Avengers Infinity War. So she's got to be in at least 6 or 7 of the top 100, maybe even more. I know that's a side note, but just what a legacy she has. This is the final movie in the Guardians trilogy, directed by James Gunn, same as volumes 1 and 2. All of these movies have been bangers, but this one might be the best of the bunch, or at least as good as number 1. This one is very much the Rocket Raccoon story, and his friends are there to help him with a dire situation which connects to his tragic past. And that tragic past part is very crucial to this story because this one has such a strong emotional center. The effectiveness of the drama largely comes from Rocket's backstory, and a lot of what we get in the key points of the story is really heartbreaking. I never thought I'd feel so emotional about a raccoon and an otter. But this movie is not all tears. It is a superhero movie, and an MCU superhero movie at that, so there are some badass action scenes. The most iconic of the bunch being the extended one-shot scene in the 3rd act, where the whole team is kind of taking out a squad of goons. It's dazzling. It's a true superhero movie action scene. And even right before that scene, there's such a great hero shot of the Guardians, which kind of has become a mainstay of this series. When you see that crew walking up about to get a job done in slow-mo, like you know it's on. There's also another great action scene near the beginning involving a character who was teased at many years ago and is finally delivered on, Adam Warlock. He's a great addition to this movie as well and gave me quite a few laughs. Speaking of which, James Gunn really brings the comedy with this one as he always does. These characters are such a perfect fit together. They bounce off each other so seamlessly, and there's a real quick wit to the jokes, which is the kind of thing I just love. And the movie looks great, despite being very CGI dependent. The character designs and locations are just gushing with creativity, so the special effects really do enhance the movie in a way that might be a crutch or a hindrance for a lesser movie. There's some great villain designs in this. Even a lot of the henchmen and like the putties, for lack of a better word, have pretty great looks. There's a duo of henchmen that we see at one point that I'm pretty sure had to have been directly inspired from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles characters, Bebop and Rocksteady. But the primary villain is the High Evolutionary played by Chukwudi Iwuji. probably messed that name up. Now, unfortunately, he does fall into the trap of being a one-and-done villain, which is pretty common to Marvel, but they really do make you hate this guy. He's fleshed out in a way that not all MCU villains are. And he has this particular look that I've never seen in Marvel, where his face is like a human skin mask stretched over his head. He looks like Murphy from RoboCop, which is hilariously pointed out by Star-Lord. The High Evolutionary's face also kind of reminded me of the Sona from a Star Trek movie called Insurrection. That's a deep cut, but look that one up. Don't watch it though. But what the heroes end up doing with the High Evolutionary is something that, visually speaking, I would not have expected to see in a Marvel movie. It's pretty hardcore, and yet they managed to keep the movie at a PG-13 rating. Moving on to other characters, I will say that this version of Gamora can be a total bitch, which does rub me the wrong way a little bit, but if I'm going to look at it objectively, or as much as that's possible, I think it kind of fits the story they're trying to tell. It leaves you feeling a certain way toward the end, and it's uncomfortable, but it is what you're meant to feel. James Gunn is kind of putting you in the shoes of another character by making these choices, so you get kind of a taste of this character's pain. I guess the fanboy in me just wanted to see a neat little bow on top of that storyline at the end, but it's probably a smarter move to end it on a note of, sometimes these things don't always work out the way we want, but they work out in their own way. Speaking of, the primary Guardians crew all have their own little arcs at the end, many of which are bittersweet. I really love what they did with Drax particularly. That was really touching considering how it plays into his lore, which is established in the first movie. Peter Quill's arc was nice too, but I was very distracted by something that I'll talk about in the spoiler section as it relates to him. I'd say Guardians 3 expertly ties up this trilogy with care. This is a trilogy I love. I loved the first movie when it came out 10 years ago, and I love this most recent entry. I'm sad to see this end, but man, it went out in style. Number 3, Poor Things. For those of you that haven't heard of this movie, I want to say the first thing you need to know is to ignore the title. And that's probably actually also true for the other movies from this filmmaker, Yorgos Lanthimos. He makes some off-the-wall shit. He's done some other movies that I've seen and love, like The Killing of a Sacred Deer, which is not about a deer, and The Lobster, which is surprisingly not about a lobster, per se. This is a strange fucking movie, man. Strange in all the right ways. Strange music, strange camera angles, strange premise, strange lenses. Almost Truman Show at times in the camera and lens choices they make. This is a kind of Frankenstein story where Emma Stone plays Bella Baxter. She's the result of a mad scientist's madness. She's new to the world, and in many ways she's like a child, and she's here to capture the human experience. Now, I really want to say what other movies this one is like to kind of give a good sense of comparison, but I'm finding that to be pretty difficult. I actually Googled movies like Poor Things, and one of the first results was The Holdovers. I feel like I can safely say that this movie is not like The Holdovers. In my own mind, I'd more relate this to The Lighthouse in terms of like the bizarre surrealism, and maybe like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas in terms of the odd style of comedy that it gives you. The humor in this movie is hard to describe, but it's certainly atypical. Mark Ruffalo cracked my shit up at times. He's actually an interesting entry to this movie because when his character first showed up, I found myself hoping that he wouldn't be sticking around for any significant amount of time. He's pretty off-putting in his introduction, but he does stick around, and I pretty quickly turned around on him because he's actually a really great entry to the movie. I forget how great of an actor he is sometimes. Him and Bella have some really great exchanges.
You fucked for money.
And as an experiment, and it is good for our relationship as it gladdens my heart toward you. My heart has been a bit dim on your weepy, sweary person lately.
You are a monster, a whore and a monster, a demon sent from hell to rip my spirit to shreds, to punish my... Tiny sins with a tsunami of destruction to take my heart and pull it like toffee to ruin me. I look at you and I see nothing but ugliness.
That last bit was uncalled for and makes no sense, as your odes to my beauty have been boring but constant. And this simple act of letting a strange man ride on me has erased all that.
Fuck! You hoard yourself.
What you are now going to explain to me is bad. Can I never win with you?
It is the worst thing a woman can do!
The two of them have a big dance scene together at one point. The dance scene is a work of art. I have said before that I kind of cringe at the idea of a script that says, and now the characters do a funny dance. But this actually works really well. If you're curious, I have seen this full scene in high quality all over Instagram. But I think this scene is better with the full context of the movie, so just watch the movie as a whole. The mad scientist I mentioned earlier is Willem Dafoe, who I just respect more and more all the time. He is absolutely magnetic, and he looks insane. He's the father to Bella in a way, and he has some great monologues which are equally funny and disturbing. But the main focus is Bella, Emma Stone. The journey she goes on really keeps you guessing, and it never gets boring. It's just so good. It's fascinating. Sometimes it's gross. Sometimes it's heartwarming. Sometimes it's kind of tense and dangerous. She experiences a lot of life in a short amount of time, and has this kind of newborn baby-like approach to these experiences, which is one of the things that makes her escapade so compelling. And I talked about the surrealism earlier. I can't stress that enough with this movie. You get these like incredible title cards between the chapters, for example, as we follow Bella along in her journey. They kind of represent the stages of growth she's going on, but they're so visually bizarre, as is just about everything in this movie. The places and the backgrounds definitely give you the idea that this is not exactly our world, but some kind of close parallel world from maybe 150 years ago. Emma Stone, man, she's captivating. Sometimes she can be endearing, sometimes she's repulsive, sometimes she's frustrating, but ultimately she's a really good sympathetic protagonist that comes into her own, despite her many trials and tribulations, which usually come in the form of horny men. She has a big job to do with this unique kind of character she's playing. It's probably an actor's dream. I'm not sure if a lot of people will have seen this movie, and that kind of does bum me out. It even almost slipped by me. I had to drive a couple cities over just to see this, but about a month after I saw it, it was getting played more widely in theaters, so I'm kind of hoping that this one gets the recognition and the eyeballs it deserves. I kind of spend too much time on social media, and I think one of the very easy generic complaints that I see people make about modern movies all the time is there's nothing original anymore, or everything nowadays is Marvel, or some variation of that complaint. Unique movies like this one, they do exist, and they do disprove those complaints just by existing, but people that make those really basic and easy arguments just don't see them. So I'm hoping this one kind of becomes an everything everywhere all at once scenario, where this random small original movie breaks its way into the mainstream, because it really deserves to. This movie is a gem. See this movie. Do it for Bella. Number 2, The Whale. The Whale stars Brendan Fraser and Sadie Sink, and is one of the most depressing, dour movies I've seen in a long time, and I loved it. Brendan Fraser plays Charlie, a morbidly obese man who realizes he's not long for this world, so he tries to reconnect to his estranged daughter, Ellie. The performances almost go without saying here. They are so fucking good. Brendan Fraser is a powerhouse of a dramatic actor, and I'm gonna be honest, I didn't even know it. Now, I love Airheads and Encino Man as much as the next 90s kid, but I had no idea he was on this level. Sadie Sink is great as the unholy demon spawn of a daughter of Charlie in this movie. Maybe just an ever so slight typecast, because she is a bit of a snarky firecracker in Stranger Things as well, but she's on a whole nother level of evil here. I hated her character this entire movie. And I suppose in a way that's a testament to how well she did. Hong Chow plays Charlie's only friend left, Liz. Her character kind of grounds this movie and looks at things from the perspective that myself or another outsider might. Like, she wants to help Charlie, who has no one else really, but she realizes that maybe she's enabling him, and she's just in a very difficult place in this situation. She's really great in this. I saw her in another movie a few years ago called Downsizing, which is one of the worst movies I've seen in recent years, and I'm glad to see that she's kind of moved on to bigger and better things. The Whale is beyond a drama. It's a tragedy. This movie will not make you feel good. It's so dark and uncomfortable. The colors are muted, like you're constantly in a dimly lit room. Within the first few minutes, Aronofsky just immediately sets the tone for this just unpleasant, nasty feeling and tells you what kind of movie this is gonna be. It's actually a pretty disturbing thing that we get in the first few minutes of this movie. You do feel bad for Charlie in this, but you as the viewer are also sometimes pretty unhappy with him too. He's a very flawed character, but he has a big heart, so ultimately you do root for him. And eventually we do uncover the source of his misery and the reason for his isolation, and it's just more tragedy on top of tragedy. Absolutely gut-wrenching, but a wonderful story. There's a particular moment in this movie that's just extremely distressing. It happens at Charlie's lowest point, and it's one of the hardest things to watch I've seen in a long time. I can't say exactly what it is because it's a bit spoilery, but the disturbing factor comes largely because of what you see on screen, which is horrifying, but also subtly due to what you hear during this scene. There's some sound effects that just add so much to this revolting event that you're witnessing. It's absolutely fucked up, this scene. It's disturbing, and if someone told me they saw this scene and then puked afterwards, I would not at all be surprised. But this movie has very few locations, which is used very effectively to kind of give you this feeling of isolation, like you're stuck in this room with Charlie. That's how you feel. And he's a man who has not ventured into the outside world for a very long time. The aspect ratio is also very narrow. I don't know the specifics, but it feels like it's 4:3 or close to 4:3. But it's very narrow, so the claustrophobia is very much felt. Charlie is kind of in a prison of his own making, and you're right there with him. The limited locations here also make this feel like a stage play, so when I learned later that it was in fact based on a play, I was not at all surprised. And my final point on this movie is the effects. Brendan Fraser has some intense prosthetics in this movie to portray a 600-pound man. They are absolutely flawless. Some of the best prosthetics I've seen in a long time. Practical effects, they're always a welcome sight to see, and they absolutely nailed them in this movie. So yeah, I didn't expect this movie to be as somber as it is before I saw it. For some reason, I kind of expected this to be more of a feel-good redemption story. And as you're watching it, when you start to think that it might be, the movie just takes that shit right away from you and lets you know that, no, this is not that kind of movie. Come to think of it, I've never seen an Aronofsky movie that didn't leave me with that, fucked up feeling. This one absolutely has that. The ending to this movie is heartbreaking, and any sense of satisfaction you're left with at that point is bittersweet at best. This story is just really bold and unforgiving, and it doesn't care if you're uncomfortable because this is the story of Charlie, and it feels very honest for telling the story in that way. I can't recommend this movie enough. Number 1. Godzilla -1. Ah, yes, the spiritual sequel to Oppenheimer. No, I am joking, of course, but I do want to try an experiment and watch Godzilla -1 and Oppenheimer back to back, because, like Dunkirk and The Darkest Hour, I do think they could actually mesh together really well. This was definitely my biggest surprise of the year. I agreed to go see this movie with Steve and Alan because, why not? I go to the movies with them a few times a year, and it's always good to spend some time with the boys. I had zero expectations for this to be anything beyond serviceable, but what they do here is pretty goddamn amazing. This movie takes place in Japan, post-World War II, and you should know that this is a human story above all else. You might think a monster movie needs to focus on monsters more so than the human characters, and there's probably times where that is the focus and that works, and that's great, but this movie's strength is the drama. We follow a man named Koichi. He's a man at the end of his rope, and on the worst day of his life, he meets someone very special. Not a friend, not a lover, but fucking Godzilla. Godzilla enters this man's life and the lives of many others in Japan and just absolutely wreaks havoc. Godzilla is a truly terrifying presence in this movie, to the likes of which I have not seen before. Now, I have seen a bunch of Godzilla movies. A lot of the older ones have their charm, but some can get pretty stupid. I'm looking at you, Godzilla's Revenge. This one is more like the original Godzilla. It takes itself very seriously, and it's crafted masterfully enough for you to take it seriously as well. Yes, I'm talking about a movie where the title character is a giant lizard creature. You really do feel for this guy, Koichi, and you feel for those close to him and the struggles they go through. It's an incredibly gripping story, even when Godzilla is nowhere to be found. But when Godzilla is on screen, he is truly epic. You get a real sense of the desperation of the people involved, and just the scale of this fucking walking nightmare of a beast. I was definitely on the edge of my seat at times. I think the way the humans ultimately decide to handle the threat of Godzilla here is fantastic. It's really creative, and when the plan starts to unfold, it gets extremely tense. There are some revelations which really tie the story together perfectly. The highs and lows of this movie are just extremely satisfying, and that goddamn Godzilla is a menace. Now, this movie had a reported budget of around $15 million. That's either bullshit or this is the best handling of money in the history of movies. This movie does not look cheap. The effects are nearly perfect, and the locations alone, I just don't know how they pulled this off. It's just a remarkable feat of filmmaking that will be the basis of other high-budgeted movies for years to come, in terms of budget to quality ratio. This movie just absolutely has to be seen. You will cry during a Godzilla movie. Now, my last special guest to do a call-in is our old friend Steve, who I saw this movie with. He has some very in-depth thoughts on this movie, so prepare yourselves. You know Steve loves to talk. Over to you, Steve.
10/10 would recommend. That movie was awesome.
Yeah, so that was my personal list. You probably disagreed with a lot of it. Don't write in. Now I'm going to do a pretty short spoiler section, so spoilers ahead, be warned. Transformers Rise of the Beast spoilers. So earlier I said there's something about this movie that's making an attempt to drum up millennial interest for future installments. Well, there's a scene at the very end of this movie that plays like a mid-credit scene or a post-credit scene, but it's actually neither. It's just the last scene of the movie. So the main human character of the movie, basically the new Shia LaBeouf guy, is at a job interview. Looks like he's applying for a standard office job. But it turns out, these people aren't what they seem. This is not a normal job after all. It's revealed that he's actually applying for G.I. Joe! Yeah. So the guy performing the interview presses a button and a wall opens up and reveals a giant warehouse with absolutely nothing recognizable inside. And he gives the main character a kind of Nick Fury style speech about recruitment.
We could really use someone like you, Noah. Why don't you think about it?
It's kind of like the filmmakers finally got around to seeing the 2008 movie Iron Man and said, yeah, we should do something like that. It's absolutely pathetic and laughable, Did I ever mention I hate the Transformers movies? Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny spoilers. I just wanted to say a quick thing about a couple side characters. Sala is in the movie. Remember him from Raiders of the Lost Ark? And the Indiana Jones ride video from Disneyland, I guess? He's in the movie, but he has absolutely nothing to do. His role is actually kind of sad. He gives Indy a ride to the airport, and then he's like, you know, Indiana Jones, I want to come with you. And Indiana Jones is like, no, you can't. And Sala's like, fuck, all right. Like, what the fuck is this? Like, why is he here? He's goddamn giving him a ride to an airport? Also, the fact that Short Round was not included in this movie is a fucking crime against humanity. For such a fan service heavy movie, you'd think he'd at least have a cameo, if not then a major role as one of his sidekick buddies. Phoebe Waller-Bridge wasn't doing much for anyone, so why not? And then lastly about this movie, they killed Shia LaBeouf off screen. Mutt from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I don't know, I just find this hilarious. Like, what do we do with this guy that no one wants back? He fucking died in the war. He's dead. Will we ever see him again? No, he's fucking dead. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania. The final confrontation in this movie eventually leads up to a showdown between Kang and Ant-Man, like a 1v1. And they just have a fist fight, which is pretty funny because Kang just lights this dude up. Kang whoops his ass. Like he's really channeling Damien from Creed 3 in this one. He beats the shit out of Ant-Man, but of course, you know, the hero eventually wins. Like, Ant-Man's allies eventually, like, reappear and help him in beating Kang, and then Kang gets, like, sucked into a Tron machine. But I just found it amusing that it was a good old-fashioned street fight that ended this movie. Fast X spoilers. Okay. The ending of this movie is so fucking stupid. Letty and Cypher. Cypher is Charlize Theron. You may or may not remember her from some of the previous movies. They're in prison together in this movie, like a super high security prison that doesn't exist in the real world. Now, these two are sworn enemies, but during the movie, they hatch an escape plan and they have to work together. So they escape the prison only to find out that they're like in Antarctica or some shit. I don't know, maybe they're on Hoth. I didn't see any Wampas though. They're in a frozen tundra wasteland. They escape in the snow. They do have snow gear, by the way. And they make it over a ridge. And when they look over this ridge, they see Giselle, Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot. She's alive, what? And she's in a submarine. I guess the submarine they stole in part 6, which answers the question, whatever happened to that submarine? She's been living in this, I guess, and she didn't really die in 6. And I guess she's just this one-man crew to a submarine. I don't know much about this kind of equipment, but I would think you'd need a full crew of people. I don't know, she's manning the submarine alone. It's fucking insane. There's no stakes if people cannot die. So you can't just keep bringing people back who already died. So we get some credits, right? And then this movie has a mid-credit scene. Now this, I'm more in favor of. So in the mid-credit scene, there's some SWAT guys. They're going through a facility. One of the SWAT guys gets a phone call from the villain, Dante. Now Dante, who is Jason Momoa, threatens this SWAT member's life, and the SWAT guy takes off his mask to reveal Hobbs, Dwayne Johnson, The Rock. So what they're setting up here is something that we thought we'd never see. They're going to be bringing The Rock back for the next Fast movie, Fast XI, Fast 11, I guess. Now this I am excited for, because this franchise really, really fucking needs The Rock. It might be the only franchise on Earth that does, but man, I am glad this is happening. I really hope this franchise gets good again. Here's to hoping. The Marvels, spoilers. This movie has a mid-credit scene. It is a Marvel movie, after all. Monica Rambeau, she made the hero sacrifice at the end of the movie, but she wakes up. She's not dead, she was transported somewhere. And she's in another place, and she sees her mother, who had previously died of cancer. So this is very shocking to her. But no one cares about that part. What we see and what we care about is she looks over and it's fucking Beast from X-Men. The blue furry science bitch himself. And I'm pretty sure in this version he was voiced by Kelsey Grammer. It sounded like that version of Beast. Now Kelsey Grammer played Beast fantastically in X-Men 3. In this one it looks like a fully CGI character though, and the effects do look pretty wonky, but I was able to set that aside because I fucking fanboyed out. This is the first time we have seen an official X-Men character in an MCU movie, so this was supposed to be a big deal. Unfortunately, this movie didn't generate enough hype for this scene to have the kind of weight that it should, but I gasped when I saw this in theaters. It did get me excited, even if it was kind of like cheap fan service table scraps. Also, I did a podcast on all of the X-Men movies with my bro Ellis at the Total Movie Recall podcast. That was recorded about a year ago, almost. Hopefully that comes out someday. Keep your eyes open on his channel for that. I'll keep my fingers crossed too. John Wick Chapter 4 spoilers. So I talked about how the ending of this movie might be a lie. Well, at the end of John Wick Chapter 4, our hero, John Wick himself, is killed! But like immediately after this movie, there were hints from people involved that actually he might not be dead. I think Keanu Reeves said, he's dead for now, which implies that he will not be dead later. And Keanu is already slated to play John Wick in another spin-off movie that's coming out next year. So like, come on. Again, there's no stakes when the hero will not die. And he's almost always about to die in this series. And in this case, they tell us he actually did die. But if they make another one and he's alive, then that undermines the stakes of this movie. And look, maybe not everyone will get hung up on this like I do, but it fucking bugs me. The Flash spoilers. My first spoiler comment for this is about Supergirl. During the ending set piece of the movie, the two Flashes, Michael Keaton Batman and Supergirl, they team up and they have to stop General Zod. Now it's the General Zod from Man of Steel, Michael Shannon. And it's kind of that exact Man of Steel world domination plot on Zod's part, except this time there's no Superman to stop him, because in this universe there is no Superman. The Kryptonian is Supergirl, Kara. So she has to take on Zod instead of Superman. But Zod kills her. Now Barry has access to the Speed Force and can basically time travel and have them do a do-over. So he does that, and then Zod kills her again. The same thing happens again and again and again, and Barry realizes like, oh shit, she can't beat this guy. She cannot beat Zod. I love this choice. I think it's a very bold choice, and I totally respect it. Because Kara Supergirl is not Clark. She's just not on that level. She's also been in a Russian prison for years until recently, so she's basically no match for Zod. This movie makes a very clear statement that she cannot beat him, and then it sticks with that choice. Now, if this movie went the other way and was basically a case of, okay, Supergirl can beat Zod too, same as Clark did, that would basically take away from who Superman is in this universe and what he accomplished in Man of Steel. Man of Steel is not a movie I love, but they are respecting it a lot with this decision. Next thing for The Flash is, again, in this ending area, and there's many cameos that come up in this area that I'm going to spoil. So to set things up, Barry is fighting an evil, multiverse, corrupt version of himself. They're in a Speed Force time distortion bubble of some kind. And a bunch of universes in the multiverse are starting to collide. It's not sustainable, and basically the universe is falling apart, and the multiverse is within it. But we get glimpses into these other multiverses and see some really cool shit, but also maybe some questionable shit. So we get to see Christopher Reeve as Superman. We get to see Adam West as Batman, and Helen Slater as Supergirl from that Supergirl movie that no one likes. Now these are alright, these are kind of neat and cute to see them, right? The CGI'd versions of them in some cases. In some cases it's just voices pulled from the show, in the case of Adam West. But the big one here, and the one that the movie showcases for longer, is Nick Cage as Superman. And I'm talking 90s long hair Nick Cage. And who is this version of Superman fighting? A giant spider. If you know the story of the ill-fated movie Superman Lives, then this scene was just for you. This is a true nod to geeks, which made me audibly gasp, and I wasn't the only one. I heard other gasps in my theater too. I thought that was so cool. I loved that. Now the questionable cameo / Easter egg here is we also see George Reeves as Superman. George Reeves is a guy that basically hated playing Superman and ended up killing himself. Maybe don't dig him up and bring him back into a movie that he would have definitely wanted no part of. I don't know. That one was not good. Creed 3 spoilers. So I talked about the final fight between Damien and Adonis. What they do here is really cool. They transform the setting to kind of establish how personal this match is between the two of them. So they're in a boxing ring and the audience disappears because in the minds of the fighters, they're like the only two people in the world in that moment. Even the noise of the crowd dissipates, and for part of that scene, a cage kind of forms around them. This is a meaningful and kind of intimate event in their lives, and there's just some cool shit thrown in here. This is certainly nothing I've ever seen in a Rocky movie before, so I can see why that would be off-putting to some people, but here it works, right? The fight is both internal and external for these two. And hey, if you don't like it, I suppose you'd be happy knowing that it's actually a pretty short portion of the boxing match, but I really liked it. Last thing with this Creed movie is that it does feel like the final chapter of the Adonis Creed story. But it gives you an idea, and it's not overstated by any means, but it gives you the idea that the torch is going to be passed down from Adonis Creed to his daughter to kind of continue the legacy of Creed. So maybe in 10 years we'll get another Creed movie about the women's boxing champion, Amara Creed, and people online will complain about how it's woke. So I look forward to that. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse spoilers. There's a place in this movie called the Spider Society where all the Spider-Mans of the multiverses congregate and solve problems. If you're in any way a Marvel Comics fan, then the Spider Society will have you in a state of non-stop Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the Scream meme with the little and sometimes not so little Easter eggs. One of the many spider characters that we got that I liked a lot was a guy called the Scarlet Spider, who is an old favorite of mine from when I was a kid. He is basically played as a joke, but that's okay because his jokes worked very well for who he is. But there's so many others. You'll definitely find your favorite version of Spider-Man thrown in the mix at some point, including Tobey Maguire, who is featured through some clips from the Sam Raimi movies. Same with Andrew Garfield. And then Donald Glover is there to make a live-action appearance, and he's actually interacting with the animated characters. He's playing the Prowler, which I believe is a callback to one of the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies. A lot of neat little touches. Also, there's a version of Spider-Woman here that's predominantly featured who fights crime while pregnant, and I just find that to be irresponsible. And then Peter B. Parker from the last movie is back, and he literally has a baby with him, including during fight scenes. Now that one does make for some kind of cutesy comedy, so I'll give it more of a pass than the other one. But still, great movie, great Easter eggs. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 spoilers. There is something I did not like about this movie toward the end regarding Peter Quill. There's a moment where it seems like he's about to make a self-sacrifice for the team, and then he gets launched into outer space. Very reminiscent of the first movie, him being exposed. So he's exposed to outer space with no suit, no Star-Lord mask to form over his face for some reason. I feel like he should have had that. But he's dying in outer space. You see his skin start to freeze, and then his fucking head expands. It starts blowing up like thunder in Big Trouble in Little China. Like his head's gonna fucking explode. And then he's rescued by Adam Warlock. So he's brought back into normal atmosphere, and then he's just okay. But he shouldn't be okay. His face and head were completely deformed while being exposed to outer space. You can't just come back to normal atmosphere and be okay. He should have 100% died. I mean, if you just see his head, that's the head of a dead man. I call bullshit on that. Now, the movie is great enough to give this a pass, but it's a noticeable pockmark on an otherwise great movie. Okay, that's it for the spoiler section. My next thing is something a little odd. It's just something I've wanted to talk about for a long time and something that I've been hearing on podcasts and on YouTube for like 3 or 4 years, maybe more. And it's a term called superhero fatigue. It's not comic book movie fatigue. I think if anyone calls it that, then they're probably just doing so in error, because I don't think anyone actually means that in the literal sense. Like, for example, there's probably not many people out there that like wouldn't see Old Boy or David Fincher's The Killer just because they're based on comic books. No, I don't think that's what people mean. And don't split hairs with me on the difference between graphic novels and comics. It's whatever. Just one thing as far as I'm concerned. So you might see discourse about superhero fatigue online when a movie like Ant-Man 3 comes out or Aquaman 2. And if you Google search the term superhero fatigue, you'll see tons of articles about the topic. Superhero fatigue is something that does not exist for me. And I might not be alone. Tell a little story, I guess. When I was young, when I was in 2nd grade, my teacher had a classroom like bonus program for students that did well in class. He gave you something that were called super bucks, which you could like redeem for little things like small toys, marbles, trinkets, and trading cards. So I would get a lot of super bucks back then, and I would spend them on trading cards. And that's actually how I first got into collecting. Around this time in my life, my dad would take me shopping with him, and I would occasionally want to go to a comic shop. Now, I didn't necessarily collect comics or really know anything about them, but I had a liking for trading cards because I started collecting those in class. And comic shops were like trading card heaven. So I started collecting more trading cards, all different kinds, baseball, football, and then I got into stuff that wasn't sports related. I remember I had Simpsons trading cards, Harley Davidson trading cards, Nightmare Before Christmas trading cards, and then eventually X-Men trading cards. Now, I got very attached to the X-Men trading cards very quickly. They became my sole focus of collecting. So when my dad would take me out to a comic shop and he'd give me a small amount of money to spend, I wouldn't use them on comics or toys. I would always go for X-Men trading cards. Eventually, I got into that X-Men animated series, absolute classic. But I believe it was the trading cards that led me in that direction. And then when my collection grew and my interest in that particular thing grew, I got into other areas of Marvel. I also got into Batman, which I was slightly predisposed to liking because I saw the '89 movie in theaters. That's actually kind of funny because my mom would take me to the movies as a toddler. I was only 3 when I saw it. Because I would just kind of sit there and shut up during a movie, even if it wasn't like a cartoon or necessarily a kid's movie. But anyway, this led me into getting into superheroes, and later on I got an appreciation for comic books, but my love of superheroes never left me. It started when I was young, and it's been with me ever since. I still collect 90s toys to this day, and my favorite of which are X-Men figures. So you can only imagine how excited a geek like me was when the superhero movie craze kicked off. I was so happy to see like the quality of movies we started getting, especially the ones that were Marvel. It's like I waited for those movies my whole life. So now we've had these movies for a long time. Maybe to some we've hit a point where there's no more novelty to these movies anymore. The first X-Men movie came out like 24 years ago now. The first MCU movie was like 14 years ago. But my personal position is that the superhero will never be something I'm fatigued by. Like, this kind of thing was baked into my DNA from an early age. And if I still like that kind of thing all these years later, I think it's safe to say I'll like it forever. Superhero movies, like any movies, can be good or bad, but I will probably always have some inner bias in favor of them. And I don't think I'm the only person in the world with this kind of deep-seated permanent fandom. I'm sure there's other people out there who are just like me in this same respect. So superhero fatigue, I don't have it. I'll never have it. That's what I wanted to say on that topic. As for the problem with Marvel movies as I see it, I do think there is a problem. And I'm of the opinion that Marvel built up to Thanos wonderfully, but people forget that not all of those movies leading up to that point were good. Just like now, they're not all good. They weren't all good then. Thor 2, the Iron Man sequels, Avengers 2, Incredible Hulk. Varying levels of quality within that list, but not great ones. There might be some others too. But when we got what everything for years and years led up to, that was really awesome. Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame really delivered. But I left Endgame a little bit sad because I knew that it was all downhill from there. I knew after those heights that it would be a while before we got something that great and epic again. I think that's proving to be true. The MCU has hit some heights that are not easy to hit again, and it may take a long time before we get there again. Unfortunately, I think after you reach the top, there's really only one direction to go from there, and that's down. Now, I do think the MCU will probably be great again. We still get some gems in there occasionally, but time will tell. Now, I want to thank you to those that listened to this episode. I know this was a little bit different, kind of an experiment, just kind of a fun little thing to do for our comeback. I know it was a long break, but I am really glad to be back from it. Give us a thumbs up on YouTube, leave us a positive rating and written review on Apple Podcasts. Film Dylan, the ball's in your court now. All right, we love you and good night.